Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight we journey to the warm hills of southern Spain, where quiet courtyards hide the memory of flowing water and the faint scent of jasmine drifts through the air. Lanterns glimmer against pale stone, and the sound of a fountain folds softly into the night. Here, behind ancient walls, paradise is not a promise, but a design. A balance of light, shade, and stillness that has endured for centuries. So before the silence of night surrounds you, take a moment to like and subscribe, just if this brought you peace of mind. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The story of Al-Andalus begins not with a sword or a crown, but with water. You can almost hear it, trickling softly through narrow stone channels glinting under the sunlight of southern Spain, where it has been coaxed and persuaded for more than 1,000 years to flow precisely where human hands wanted it. When the Muslims of North Africa crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in 711, they brought not only armies and scholars, but also an entire philosophy of water, how to tame it, how to cherish it, and above all, how to make it speak of paradise. The Iberian Peninsula, after all, is not an easy place for paradise. Summers scorch, rivers shrink to mere memories, and dust rises in thin veils that can coat entire valleys. But in those dry lands, the newcomers saw opportunity. To them, gardens were not indulgences. They were acts of devotion, miniature worlds mirroring the divine order. The Quran speaks of gardens beneath which rivers flow, and those words settle deeply into Andalusi soil. They took root in courtyards, in palace compounds, in hidden cloisters, where fountains whispered all day long. At first, these gardens were simple, geometric plots enclosed by low walls, shaded by fruit trees, and divided by narrow channels of running water. The logic was symmetry, the language geometry, and the feeling tranquil, inevitability. The early palaces of Córdoba, Seville, and Granada were threaded with them, each a quiet sanctuary, where the world beyond the wall could fade into silence. It wasn't about grandeur, it was about order, the same order one could glimpse in stars, or in verses, or in the layered petals of an orange blossom. Cordova in the 10th century shimmered with this aesthetic. Under the Umayyad dynasty, the city became the cultural heart of Western Islam, its libraries overflowing, its workshops humming. The caliphs built terraces along the hills at Medina Sahara, an enormous complex meant to embody both imperial power and heavenly calm. Within its walls were courtyards laced with marble channels, basins carved with inscriptions, and gardens filled with pomegranate, jasmine, and rose. The fragrance alone must have been enough to soften the hard edges of life. But even this glory was fleeting. Medina Sahara would later be sacked, its stones scattered, its marble reused by later builders. Yet the memory of its gardens lingered, traveling from court to court like a song that no one quite forgot. The formula symmetry, water, enclosure continued to define beauty across Al-Andalus for centuries. Even modest homes had courtyards, or patios where families gathered around a central fountain. It was a kind of democratization of paradise, small and human-scaled. The Andalusi garden was more than decoration. It was a machine for cooling, a refuge from heat, a subtle expression of power. Water evaporated, air moved, shade deepened. The rhythmic sound of dripping water replaced conversation. Visitors were lulled into a slower tempo of existence, one that suited both contemplation and the art of doing absolutely nothing, which, in a way, is the purest luxury any civilization can produce. As Islamic rule matured in Iberia, New dynasties rose and fell, but the gardens endured. The Almoravids, Berber rulers from North Africa, brought with them stricter tastes, plainer lines, and more austerity. Yet even they found themselves unable to resist the charm of Andalusi horticulture. They expanded irrigation systems, maintained ancient aqueducts, and continued the careful balance between utility and grace. After them came the Almohads, who raised Seville to splendor, building the Giralda Tower and surrounding it with perfumed courtyards. In these spaces, architecture and garden merged so seamlessly that one could hardly tell where one ended and the other began. Arches framed glimpses of greenery, carved stucco caught the reflections of water. Gardens were rooms without ceilings, and rooms were gardens under roofs. It was as though the builders understood that true comfort lies in dissolving the boundary between indoors and out, a lesson modern designers rediscover every generation pretending it's new. By the time the Nasras established their court in Granada in the 13th century, the Andalusi garden had reached its perfection. The hilltop fortress, the Alhambra, became a world of enclosed courtyards, glittering tiles, and flowing water. It's hard to overstate how deliberate everything was. The Court of the Lions, perhaps the most famous of these gardens, centers on a marble fountain supported by 12 carved lions. From it, 4 channels run outward, dividing the courtyard into quadrants, echoing the ancient Persian idea of the Chahar Bar, the fourfold garden. Symbolically, it represented the 4 rivers of paradise: water, milk, honey, and wine. Practically, it kept the courtyard perpetually alive with the faint sound of running water. Standing there today, one might think the place exists outside time, but it's actually an artifact of intense human effort. Behind the serenity lies engineering, hidden pipes, careful gradients, endless maintenance. The Nasrids built cisterns and conduits that ate water from the Darro River high into the palace complex. Every drop was guided by mathematics and patience. The sound of water was no accident. It was designed, tuned, and orchestrated like music. In such surroundings, rulers could recline on low couches, listen to poets recite, or simply let their gaze wander along the reflections in the pools. For them, the garden wasn't just a retreat from the world. It was the world in miniature, orderly and obedient, fragrant and contained. Outside the walls, politics could be messy. Inside, every leaf had its place. Even the plants chosen had symbolic resonance. The cypress stood for eternity, the rose for beauty, the orange for abundance, the pomegranate for unity and fertility. These weren't wild spaces but cultivated dreams, and yet, despite their careful planning, there was always an awareness of impermanence. Flowers bloom and wither, empires rise and fall. The water that gives life also erodes stone. Perhaps that was the quiet melancholy woven into every Andalusi garden, the understanding that even paradise must fade a little each day. When the Christian kingdoms of the north gradually pushed southward, taking city after city, the gardens of Al-Andalus began to transform. New owners moved in. New tastes prevailed. Yet instead of erasing the old forms, many simply adapted them. The courtyards of Seville's Alcazar, for instance, still retain their Islamic bones beneath layers of later Renaissance ornament. Water continues to flow there, as if indifferent to human politics. The legacy of those gardens spread far beyond Spain, through translations and travelers. The ideas of symmetry, irrigation, and enclosed beauty reached Renaissance Italy, shaping villas and palaces. The notion of the garden as a microcosm of the universe, balanced, ordered, eternal, passed quietly into European thought. Even the word paradise itself, from the ancient paradisa, meaning walled enclosure, survived intact, carrying with it the faint scent of jasmine from Cordoba. And yet, the Andalusi garden remains distinct. It is smaller, more private, more intimate than its later European cousins. It speaks softly rather than declaring itself. Its perfection lies not in grand vistas but in proportions, in the interplay of light and shadow, of water and stone. To walk through one is to step into a conversation between human will and natural grace, conducted in whispers and ripples. If you listen closely, you might still hear the ghost of that conversation. The gentle splash in a narrow pool, the rustle of leaves against plaster walls, the distant hum of bees over lavender, a soundscape of survival echoing through centuries of change. It is easy to forget that these gardens were born in a world of conquest and uncertainty, that their creators lived under constant negotiation between desert and mountain, between faith and doubt, between life and dust. Perhaps that's why they valued peace so much. As twilight falls over Granada, the Alhambra glows like an ember. Tourists shuffle, cameras flash, but the water keeps flowing as it has for 700 years. The scent of citrus drifts on the air, blending with stone and history. Paradise, behind its old stone walls, endures in miniature, waiting patiently for the next visitor to lower their voice and listen. Somewhere beyond the walls, the dry hills still stretch toward the sea, and beyond them, the memory of the desert from which all this began. Because every garden, no matter how lush, is a promise made to the desert to hold it back, to coax it into gentleness, to remind it that beauty can bloom even where life seems impossible. In Al-Andalus, that promise took root and refused to die. As night deepens, the fountains quiet but never stop. Water still moves under the floors, in channels unseen, murmuring the same lines it has murmured for centuries. If you could translate it, perhaps it would simply say, "I am still here," even as the water whispered through its hidden channels. Life around those gardens carried on with a strange combination of refinement and unease. Behind the carved stucco and patterned tiles were real people. After all, courtiers, servants, poets, soldiers, and cooks, all orbiting around the shimmering calm of the fountains like moths that had forgotten what night felt like. The garden gave the illusion of stability, yet in Granada's palaces, stability was the rarest fragrance of all. The Nasrid dynasty, which raised the Alhambra to its height, ruled not from confidence, but from caution. By the time their palaces reached perfection, in the 14th century, their kingdom was a fragile fragment of what Al-Andalus had once been. North of them, Christian kingdoms pressed closer each year, and alliances had to be tended as carefully as orange trees. Inside the walls, courtiers learned the art of serenity, because showing anxiety could be as dangerous as drought. The rulers themselves lived within contradictions. They built paradises, while fearing exile, quoted poets while negotiating tribute payments, listened to the music of fountains, while keeping an ear tuned for the tramp of approaching armies. The gardens were not an escape from reality. They were a performance of endurance, to sit beneath the cypress shade and act untroubled. That was the game, the one everyone understood but never spoke of. Take Muhammad IV, who reigned during the mid-14th century and oversaw much of the Alhambra's most graceful construction. He was a ruler of elegance and uncertainty, known as much for his patronage of poets as for his diplomatic juggling act. During his reign, Granada enjoyed one of its rare intervals of relative peace. But even peace in those days had an expiration date. The king filled his palaces with verses carved in plaster, praises to God, to the monarch, to the tranquil order of creation. The words became part of the architecture, looping endlessly along arches and friezes. To walk through his court was to read a sermon written in light and water. Meanwhile, life within the city of Granada hummed along beneath the red walls of the palace hill. Streets twisted in labyrinthine patterns, narrow enough for neighbors to pass bread through windows. Artisans worked in courtyards where vines climbed the walls, their children darting between shadows. From high above, the palace gardens must have looked like patches of green embroidery stitched onto the rough brown fabric of the city. Yet even in those humble homes, the same ideal persisted. A small enclosure, a pool, a patch of greenery, a private echo of paradise. The women of the court, mostly hidden from public view, shaped the rhythm of these inner worlds. They selected the flowers, oversaw the fragrance of the corridors, taught their children to read the patterns of mosaic floors like secret maps. Poets sometimes hinted that the truest poetry of Al-Andalus lived not in books, but in these fleeting domestic scenes. A rose arranged just so, a melody hummed beside a fountain. History has left us their traces, delicate as perfume on an ancient shore. Outside the walls, the hills were changing. Forests thinned as timber fed the furnaces of war and construction. Farmers shifted to crops that could survive harsher taxes and uncertain rains. The rivers still ran, but their patience was not infinite. Drought years came and went, each one a little harder than the last. The gardens compensated with ingenuity. Aqueducts lengthened, cisterns deepened, and gardeners developed a vocabulary of quiet crisis management that any modern city might envy. To the north, the Christian courts of Castile and Aragon were discovering their own taste for paradise. When they conquered former Muslim palaces, they rarely demolished them. Instead, they renovated, layering Gothic ceilings above Islamic arches, adding family crests to fountains that had once carried Quranic inscriptions. The result was a hybrid style, part Andalusi dream, part European ambition. It was as if even the victors could not resist the calm logic of those old courtyards. By the late 15th century, however, the calm was finally thinning. The Nasrid court, pressed by allies and betrayals, fractured under its own lineage. Family rivalries spilled into open conflict, and the gardens that once echoed with poetry began to hear the sound of marching boots. The last sultan, Muhammad XII, known to Spanish chroniclers as Boabdil, was young, intelligent, and doomed. He inherited not a kingdom, but a sandcastle, its foundations already washing away. Still, within the Alhambra, the fountains kept flowing. Boabdil's mother is said to have urged him to act decisively, but the truth was that no decisive act could hold back the tide. Ferdinand and Isabella's armies advanced southward with the momentum of inevitability. Diplomacy, bribery, and prayer could only delay what everyone sensed coming. In 1492, the same year that Columbus sailed westward from Spanish shores, Granada surrendered, and the last Muslim ruler of Al-Andalus rode away from his palace for the final time. Legend says he paused on a ridge overlooking the city and wept. His mother supposedly chided him, telling him not to cry like a woman for what he couldn't defend as a man. It's a harsh story, probably embroidered by later chroniclers, but it lingers because it fits the mood, that quiet recognition that even beauty must yield to time. What's less often said is that Abdul lived for years afterward in dignified exile, a melancholy figure moving between Mediterranean courts, haunted by the memory of flowing water. After his departure, Granada's palaces entered a new phase of their life, the long sleep of history. The Christian monarchs claimed the Alhambra as their own, but for a while they didn't quite know what to do with it. Parts were used for military barracks, others for storage. Gardens dried up, then were revived. Fountains clogged and were repaired. It was never fully abandoned, but it drifted into a kind of half-life, forgotten by the world that had created it. The water still ran, but more out of habit than ceremony. Centuries later, travelers from northern Europe stumbled upon the ruins and declared them marvelous. Romantic painters turned its crumbling courtyards into symbols of lost civilizations. Poets sighed over its beauty and conveniently ignored the complex histories beneath it. By the 19th century, the Alhambra had become a pilgrimage site for dreamers, a place where the exotic East could be admired at a safe distance, framed by Spanish hills and good lighting. It was the garden of nostalgia rather than faith. Through all those centuries, the original Andalusi spirit, its precise geometry, its reverence for water, its faith in harmony, found quieter ways to persist. In the tiled patios of Córdoba, in the orange courtyards of Seville's cathedral cloisters, in the irrigation canals that still lace the fields of southern Spain, you can trace the same logic that once shaped paradise. Farmers still rely on acequias, the ancient channels first laid out under Muslim engineers. The sound of running water in a Spanish courtyard is, in a sense, the last living verse of an old poem. When evening settles over modern Granada, the palace hill glows again under electric light. Tourists line up, their footsteps echoing where poets once recited. Yet, if you walk far enough from the crowd past the courtyards and the souvenir stalls, you might still find a secluded corner where only the water speaks. The air there feels thick with memory, as if the centuries have not quite learned how to move on. Some nights, the wind carries the scent of orange blossoms through the broken lattices, and for a moment, the past and the present align. The water keeps moving, indifferent to dynasties, endlessly murmuring its refrain. It does not care who listens. It only remembers the rhythm of its own flow, patient, continuous, and strangely human. Morning in Granada arrives quietly, almost shy. The sunlight slips down from the Sierra Nevada, brushing the rooftops, catching on the red walls of the Alhambra, and sliding into its courtyards with the same delicacy it has shown for centuries. The gardens wake in slow motion, water stirring, birds testing their voices, the scent of damp earth rising through the patterned air. From the outside, everything looks eternal, but if you listen carefully, you can sense the faint tremor of change underneath. The world beyond those walls has shifted again, as it always does. In the centuries after the fall of Granada, Spain turned its gaze outward. The discovery of the Americas redirected ambition across oceans. Wealth poured in, empires expanded, and yet, within the old palaces, the fountains continued their smaller cycles. The contrast was almost comic. Conquistadors in shining armor, claiming continents, while the quiet courtyards they left behind kept tending their geraniums. A reminder, perhaps, that grandeur and serenity rarely share the same address. For a time, the Alhambra survived largely through neglect, which, paradoxically, saved it. It wasn't stripped or modernized to fit new tastes. It was simply ignored. The delicate stucco peeled, the tiles dulled, the water lost its clarity. Goats grazed near its gates, and travelers sketched its ruins as curiosities rather than heritage. But the bones of paradise are resilient. Beneath the neglect, the structure still breathed. By the 18th century, a slow awakening began. Scholars and artists from elsewhere in Europe, especially those hungry for traces of the exotic, found in Al-Andalus a muse. They arrived with sketchbooks and notebooks, describing every arch and inscription in sentimental tones. They called it Moorish, a word that flattened centuries of nuance into a single sigh. Still, they helped rescue what might have otherwise crumbled entirely. Their romanticism, though misinformed, became a lifeline. In the 19th century, the American writer Washington Irving took up residence in the Alhambra for several months. His book, Tales of the Alhambra, would reintroduce the palace to the modern world. Irving's stories were fanciful, filled with ghosts, legends, and drowsy nostalgia. Yet behind his embellishments was an unmistakable tenderness, a recognition that the place itself did not need invention. Its quiet halls and water-filled courtyards already told a story more enduring than any fable. Thanks to that wave of romantic fascination, restoration efforts began. Slowly, carefully, the gardens were revived. Water once again ran along the channels. Lilies were replanted. Citrus trees pruned. Each restoration was an act of translation, trying to understand the language of builders who had long since vanished. Archaeologists traced the lines of ancient irrigation systems, marveling at how efficiently they had been designed. Historians uncovered records describing which flowers grew where, how scents were layered through the seasons. In their hands, paradise became a technical manual, each detail a code for beauty. Meanwhile, beyond the palace, the idea of the Andalusi garden took on new forms. In Cordoba and Seville, household patios continued to follow the old logic, a small enclosure centered on a fountain or well, surrounded by potted plants. Even when the faith and language that birthed those gardens had faded, the habit remained. People still gathered around water, still measured beauty by coolness and calm. It was less theology now, more instinct. The paradox deepened in modern times. Spain industrialized, cities expanded, but within those same cities, enclosed gardens persisted as microcosms of sanity. The old patios of Cordoba became symbols of regional pride. Once a year, their gates open for a festival, and visitors wander through a labyrinth of floral courts, each one whispering a faint echo of Al-Andalus. The lineage from the Caliphate's palaces to a modern family's courtyard geranium is surprisingly direct. Both are acts of defiance against the heat, against disorder, and perhaps against time itself. Water technology, too, carries the inheritance. The medieval Escoria system, the network of irrigation ditches and canals introduced under Muslim rule, still irrigates fields across Andalusia. Farmers adjust sluice gates that have stood in the same places for nearly 1,000 years. They may not think of themselves as heirs of any empire, but their gestures trace the same patterns once used by engineers in Cordoba's golden age. Each drop follows an old command. What makes the gardens of Al-Andalus endure is not just their beauty, but their logic. They were designed for scarcity. They turned limits into aesthetics. Every drop of water mattered. Every shade of green was earned. The architects understood that pleasure had to coexist with discipline, that beauty could be sustainable long before that word became fashionable. In their geometry, one can read the earliest blueprint for harmony between human ambition and the stubborn realities of the landscape. Of course, paradise has always required maintenance. Without care, it decays quickly. The later restorations of the 20th century became an ongoing negotiation between authenticity and modern necessity. Concrete lurked behind ancient plaster, electrical wiring hid beneath tile. Tourists arrived in waves, bringing admiration and erosion in equal measure. Preservationists argued about whether to let the gardens age gracefully or to keep polishing them into postcard perfection. Meanwhile, the water continued to flow, oblivious to the debate. Some of the most haunting aspects of these places are their silences, the absences you can feel but not name. The Arabic inscriptions along the arches still proclaim faith and praise, but few who pass beneath them can read their meaning. The architecture has become a kind of fossilized poetry, admired for its form, but divorced from its words. Yet perhaps that is the fate of all art, that survives too long. It becomes a shell, and inside that shell, new generations project their own longings. Even so, the gardens retain their original emotional temperature, cool, slow, inward. They invite reflection rather than movement. Sitting by a pool in the Generalife, the summer palace just above the Alhambra, you can almost sense the old rhythm returning. The stillness settles on your shoulders. The murmur of water seeps into the background of thought, and the mind begins to drift. The place is not asleep, but it dreams. Modern Granada carries that dream in its bones. The layout of its streets, the filtered light in its courtyards, even the cadence of evening life, all trace back to the Andalusi habit of balancing exposure and retreat. The city is lively, yet shaded, social, yet private. Its people, knowingly or not, inhabit the philosophy of the garden, that the world outside may rage and roar, but within one's own walls there should be coolness, order, and the sound of water. It's easy to imagine that the old builders would recognize this persistence. They understood better than most that civilizations crumble, but habits endure. The art of channeling water, of shaping light, of creating shade, all are forms of quiet resistance, and resistance, when it flows gently, can last forever. So the gardens of Al-Andalus live on, not only in the polished courtyards of Granada and Seville, but in any small space where a person tends to beauty, despite the odds. A balcony herb garden, a city park fountain, even a window box leaning into sunlight, each is a descendant of that same impulse to carve out calm from chaos, to make a promise to the desert and keep it, one leaf at a time. As the day fades again and the shadows lengthen along the palace walls, the pattern repeats. Light, water, silence. The same slow pulse that began more than a millennium ago still moves, not only through stone channels but through memory. In that rhythm, history becomes less a series of dates and more a steady heartbeat, the sound of persistence disguised as peace. By the time the 20th century unfolded in earnest, the story of Al-Andalus had turned from local inheritance into a global fascination. Scholars came from far corners of the world, drawn by the lure of lost wisdom and the aesthetic calm of its garden. Photographers lingered in the courtyards at dawn, trying to capture that impossible blend of geometry and humidity that made the air itself seem alive. Historians argued over terminology. Was it Moorish? Was it Andalus? Was it Islamic Spain? Or simply Spain, dressed in its most introspective clothes? The debates churned on, but the fountains kept whispering, unimpressed. In an age of engines and cities, those gardens began to look like miracles. Engineers marveled at how the early Andalusi hydrologists managed to direct entire rivers through subtle gradients, ensuring that each courtyard, orchard and terrace received just enough water but never too much. Archaeologists unearthed clay pipes still intact, their joints sealed with lime and patience. It was not just architecture, it was choreography. Each drop of water entered, performed, and exited on cue. No wasted gestures, no wasted sound. Visitors, arriving from modern cities, often mistook the stillness for fragility. They expected noise, activity, maybe even spectacle. Instead, they found themselves confronted with the opposite, a space designed to slow the pulse, to turn attention inward. For some, it was spiritual, for others, unsettling. In the silence of the courtyards, one could hear thoughts forming, and not everyone enjoys that. Granada's residents, meanwhile, grew used to living alongside the ghosts of their city. The Alhambra became both monument and neighbor, a landmark that defined identity while remaining somehow apart. Children played football in its shadow. Elderly couples took evening walks along its base. The palace watched unchanged. It had become part of the city's metabolism, a quiet lung breathing through centuries. The gardens themselves entered their scientific phase. Botanists catalogued every surviving species: roses, jasmine, cypress, myrtle, laurel, pomegranate. They debated which plants were original, which imported later. Gardeners reconstructed medieval irrigation techniques, trying to understand how ancient systems could thrive without pumps or plastic tubing. The answer, predictably, lay in simplicity, gravity, balance, and an almost obsessive respect for water's natural behavior. Modern sustainability experts would eventually rebrand those principles, but the Andalusians had been practicing them since before the word ecology existed. And yet, for all their technical brilliance, the old builders had left something more profound behind: a philosophy of perception. In their world, seeing was not enough. One had to listen to the splash of water, to the echo beneath an arch, to the way light shifted through carved screens. It was a sensory education in patience. The reward for stillness was comprehension. In that sense, the Andalusi garden wasn't merely an object to admire. It was a teacher. Art historians often describe these gardens as spaces of controlled nature, which is accurate, but incomplete. They were also spaces of controlled emotion. Everything within them, the proportions, the sounds, the sense, was designed to evoke serenity, not joy, not excitement, just the tranquil middle ground where thought and feeling balance each other. Even the inscriptions carved into the walls contributed to that equilibrium. They murmured verses about divine mercy, about the fleeting nature of worldly power, about the perfection found in repetition. To a modern eye, those decorations might seem ornamental. To their creators, they were architecture in text form, walls you could read. Over time, this worldview seeped into Spanish culture in ways so subtle that few noticed. The layout of towns, the pacing of daily life, even the habit of seeking shade at midday, these are residues of Andalusi logic. The very concept of the patio as the heart of the home owes its endurance to that earlier era. To this day, a visitor entering a traditional Andalusian house steps first into quiet. The street noise stops at the door. Within, there is water, greenery, filtered light, and the faint sense that time has chosen to linger rather than pass. Elsewhere, the aesthetic spread through imitation. Architects across Europe and the Americas borrowed motifs from the Alhambra: horseshoe arches, lattice windows, tiled pools, usually stripped of their original context, but still carrying a whisper of calm. In the 19th century, Moorish revival buildings appeared in unlikely places, synagogues in Budapest, mansions in New York, theaters in Paris, each one a fragment of the old dream, refracted through the lens of nostalgia. In Granada, though, nostalgia was never theoretical. It lived in the water supply. The acacias that had once fed the palaces continued to serve ordinary homes. During dry seasons, local committees still met to allocate water in turns, following rules written before the age of print. The same legal language, the same sense of fairness, carried across dynasties and revolutions. That continuity might be the real miracle. Empires vanished, but irrigation schedules endured. As the 20th century deepened, the Alhambra and its gardens weathered new kinds of danger: tourism, pollution, and the slow erosion of meaning. Crowds arrived with cameras and itineraries, eager to consume serenity in half-hour doses. Preservationists fretted about the wear on ancient tiles, the stress of vibration from buses, the moisture imbalance caused by too many human bodies breathing in sacred spaces. The paradox was almost poetic. Millions of visitors coming to witness tranquility and, in doing so, eroding it. Yet somehow, the place adapted. Regulations were introduced, paths rerouted, numbers capped. The fountains were recalibrated so their water flow matched historical estimates. Even the lighting was adjusted to imitate moonlight rather than stage light. The effort bordered on obsession, but perhaps that was fitting. The builders of Al-Andalus had always believed that beauty was not spontaneous. It had to be engineered, tuned, and maintained. Modern caretakers were simply continuing the score. Meanwhile, historians revisited the broader legacy of Al-Andalus itself. Beyond its gardens, it had been a crucible of coexistence, imperfect but real, between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Its cities had produced translators, philosophers, and scientists whose ideas migrated north and helped ignite Europe's own intellectual awakenings. The gardens were part of that same dialogue, living metaphors for balance. Amid diversity, they demonstrated, in physical form, that order could accommodate difference, that harmony could include contradiction. This idea, delicate yet persistent, began to attract attention in a weary modern world. Environmentalists saw sustainability, philosophers saw mindfulness, artists saw abstraction. The gardens became mirrors reflecting whatever longing the viewer brought to them, and perhaps that is their final quiet trick, to remain relevant by remaining ambiguous. A pool of water shows each face differently. Late one afternoon, as sunlight filters through orange leaves, the reflection of the palace trembles in the water. The surface quivers, then steadies, returning the image to perfection. That's what the entire history of Al-Andalus feels like. A brief disturbance in the flow of time that somehow found its balance again. Empires ended, religions shifted, languages faded, but the reflection remains. The stones remember how to glow. The water remembers its root. Standing by one of those fountains, you can feel the thinness of the present moment. The sound of dripping water overlaps with centuries. You are listening to history, breathing through plumbing. It's not dramatic, not loud, just continuous, patient, self-assured. If endurance had a voice, it would sound exactly like that. As dusk falls, and the tourists disperse, the air cools. The scent of cypress sharpens, the first bats appear, and the water resumes its night rhythm. It does not hurry, it does not rest, it simply moves, carrying with it every story ever told beneath these arches, a civilization compressed into the language of flow. If you stand still enough, You might imagine the whisper again, the one that has never stopped repeating, "I am still here." Night returns, as it always does, and the Alhambra changes character once more. The tourists are gone, the souvenir stalls shuttered, and the stone begins to breathe again. The temperature drops, the tiles exhale the heat they've stored all day, and a soft mist creeps from the fountains like sighs from old lungs. If you stand by one of the courtyards at that hour, you can almost feel the centuries settle around you, not as weight, but as atmosphere. The walls don't feel ancient, they feel awake. It's a peculiar kind of consciousness, one made of scent and echo. The orange blossoms lend their sweetness to the cool air, while the faint mineral note of wet stone completes the perfume. In the dark, the pattern of the tiles becomes a constellation underfoot, a reminder that geometry was once a form of worship. Somewhere in the background, a small cascade murmurs steadily. It could be the 14th century or yesterday. Water erases the boundary. Scholars who study these gardens often write about symbolism, the rivers of paradise, the balance of the four directions, the interplay between light and water, all true, of course. But if you ask the caretakers who sweep the leaves at dawn or prune the hedges at dusk, they'll tell you something simpler. The gardens are alive. They need to be tended like any living creature. Without attention, they sulk. Without water, they die. The act of caring for them has become a kind of inheritance, passed quietly from hand to hand. Those caretakers, modern gardeners in reflective vests, are the latest in an unbroken chain, stretching back over a millennium. They know the flow of each channel, the temperament of each tree. They can tell from the sound of the fountain whether the pressure is right. To them, the Alhambra is not a relic, but a stubborn, high-maintenance elder who demands daily affection. Their work is invisible to most visitors, but it is what keeps the illusion of eternity alive. Every morning, they sweep away the evidence of time so that paradise can continue pretending it never ends. The rhythm of that labor has changed little. Even today, irrigation follows the same logic that once governed entire valleys. Water is guided by slope and gravity, not by force. It moves because the world is arranged to let it move. There's something profoundly humble in that approach, an understanding that mastery of nature comes not from domination but from cooperation. The gardeners of Al-Andalus grasped that lesson long before the modern world began to rediscover it under new labels and conferences. If you walk through the Generalife at sunrise, when the light just begins to spill over the hills, you can watch that principle in motion. Dew gathers on the leaves, and the pools mirror the sky so perfectly that it's difficult to tell where the air ends. The sound of trickling water folds into birdsong. For a moment, even the present century seems to pause. The effect is not mystical so much as procedural, an outcome of good design and relentless maintenance. Yet somehow, it feels like grace. It's easy to imagine the earlier inhabitants feeling the same calm. A poet in silk robes, a servant carrying trays of pomegranates, a queen leaning against the lattice to catch the scent of jasmine. They would have known this same air, this same stillness. Their names may be lost, but their routines remain. You can sense them in the layout itself, the sequence of paths that encourage slow movement, the balance of open and enclosed spaces that invite privacy without isolation. The garden teaches how to exist gently, how to be present without being loud. There's a peculiar tenderness in the way the place holds onto traces of people long gone, in the soft depressions worn into marble thresholds, in the faint scratches on old tiles where furniture once sat, in the surviving roots of centuries-old cypresses. The architecture keeps absorbing lives, one after another, without complaint. If buildings could speak, perhaps they would sound like these fountains, repeating themselves endlessly, but with slight variations, like memories correcting their own detail. Occasionally, restoration uncovers hidden fragments, a shard of pottery, a tool, a seed. Each one is a time capsule of ordinary life, proof that paradise was not reserved for the divine. It was inhabited by gardeners with dirt under their nails, cooks who gathered herbs from the beds, children who splashed in forbidden boodles. Those small human moments are what give the gardens their real depth. Without them, the place would be just geometry and stone. With them, it becomes almost kind. The modern visitor rarely thinks of that labor. The courtyards appear effortlessly pristine, the fountains perfectly tuned. But the reality is a daily negotiation between decay and care. Every surface demands vigilance, line to clean, plaster to patch, water to balance. The gardeners know that the moment they stop listening, the garden will begin to forget itself. That's the secret tragedy of beauty. It's always one neglected morning away from collapse, and yet they keep tending, as if by reflex. Perhaps because tending itself is the reward, to sweep, to prune, to listen to the faint echo of dripping water. These are acts of quiet resistance against oblivion. The Andalusi ideal was never about conquering time. It was about coexisting with it gracefully. In that sense, the modern caretakers are truer heirs to the old philosophy than the scholars or the tourists. They don't interpret paradise, they keep it alive. Sometimes, when the day ends and the workers lock the gates, they pause for a moment by the last fountain. There's no ceremony, no audience, just a shared silence, a nod toward the past. The garden breathes around them, content for another night. The water murmurs its gratitude in the only language it knows, looping endlessly through pipes that are older than most nations. Beyond the palace, Granada glows with electric light. Cars move where once camels trod. The air carries the smell of exhaust mingled with jasmine. Even here, the past refuses to surrender. The balance of beauty and ruin continues, just modernized a little, the way people modernize their ghosts. The city still dreams in courtyards and wakes to the sound of water. And so, the fountains whisper on through the night, oblivious to human schedules, indifferent to the noise of the modern world. They whisper because they must. It's their nature. The water slides beneath the stones, past centuries of footsteps, keeping its promise to remember. Each ripple is a fragment of a sentence that began more than 1,000 years ago, still trying to finish itself. And if you lean close enough, you might almost make out the words. They're faint, blurred by time, but unmistakable. I am still here. By the time dawn brushes the Sierra Nevada again, the Alhambra's walls are already blushing faintly, as if embarrassed by their own beauty. Morning light doesn't just illuminate, it forgives. The plaster seems softer, the carved verses less severe. Even the fountains look humble now, half asleep, their reflections trembling with the first wind. The city below stirs in fragments, church bells, car horns, footsteps on cobblestones, and for a few moments, the ancient and the modern hum together in the same key. To understand why these gardens matter, you have to look backward, not at the palaces themselves, but at the desert that birthed them. Al-Andalus was the farthest reach of an empire born under the glare of Arabian suns. Its architects and engineers carried with them a memory of scarcity so profound that it shaped every decision they made. The garden was not just decoration, it was proof that order could exist amid dryness. To coax life from arid soil was to perform theology in miniature. The desert taught humility. It also taught precision. The people who designed the Andalusi gardens understood that every element, from shade to scent to sound, had to cooperate perfectly, or the system would fail. Water had to flow at a measured pace. Too fast, and it would erode the channels. Too slow, and it would stagnate. Trees had to be placed, not for ornament, but for their cooling canopy. Even the walls were positioned to trap breezes, turning air itself into a form of architecture. Paradise, they believed, wasn't a miracle. It was good engineering, blessed by patience. There is something deeply human in that logic. When faced with an unforgiving landscape, they didn't despair. They designed, they mapped, they calculated. They listened to the soil. Their faith was practical, grounded in the conviction that beauty could be built, one irrigation ditch at a time. It's almost touching, the way devotion and geometry merged into a single discipline. And while their dynasties may have vanished, their diagrams endured. The principles they refined still shape the fields of Spain, Morocco, and beyond. In modern Granada, you can trace those same lines in the surrounding countryside. The terraced orchards, the network of irrigation channels, the almond trees spaced in rhythmic precision, all are descendants of the old hydraulic order. Farmers opened sluice gates at dawn, just as their ancestors did, letting water travel along age-worn paths. The language has changed, the ritual simplified, but the philosophy remains. It is a culture of coexistence with the environment rather than conquest of it. Every civilization has a metaphor for eternity. The Andalusians chose water, not mountains, not monuments, just water, endlessly moving, endlessly returning. They seem to understand that permanence is an illusion, that only motion endures. A static paradise is a contradiction in terms. It has to flow to survive. The trick was to make that flow graceful, to turn necessity into art. In that sense, the gardens of Al-Andalus were more than physical spaces. They were statements about how to live. They offered a model of restraint, of finding abundance within limits. In their symmetry, one can read an entire worldview that beauty and order are achievable not by excess, but by proportion. It's a lesson the modern world keeps forgetting and rediscovering in cycles, like a student who can't quite master the same equation. Occasionally, when historians write about these gardens, they slip into melancholy, lamenting the lost golden age, the vanished tolerance, the fall of civilizations. But the truth is quieter. Nothing has vanished entirely. The ideas that once flowered in Al-Andalus simply changed form. They traveled through translations and trade routes, seeding themselves in unexpected soils. The Renaissance absorbed their geometry. Modern architecture borrows their interplay of light and shadow. Even contemporary landscape designers echo their principles when they speak of harmony, sustainability, and sensory balance. The past didn't die, it diffused, and that diffusion continues. The visitor wandering through the courtyards of the Alhambra today might carry its influence home without realizing it. They might install a small fountain in a backyard, plant an orange tree near a wall, or arrange tiles in a repeating pattern that soothes the eye. Every imitation, however modest, becomes a fragment of continuity. Paradise, after all, was never meant to be hoarded. Meanwhile, in Granada itself, the relationship between past and present remains oddly symbiotic. The city thrives on its heritage, tourism, research, restoration, but also risks suffocating under it. To live beside beauty that old is to live in constant negotiation with reverence. Locals sometimes joke that the Alhambra is their most demanding neighbor, majestic, beloved, but always requiring attention. Its gardens drink as much maintenance as ever, though the hands that tend them now belong to engineers and conservators with tablets instead of scrolls. Despite modernization, the core experience hasn't changed. Step into one of those courtyards, and the outside world still dissolves. The traffic, the politics, the century itself, all fade into the hush of running water. That sensation is the true inheritance of Al-Andalus. It is not visual, but temporal, the power to slow time without stopping it. Even the desert would approve of that trick. The same desert that taught the first Andalusi gardeners restraint still lies, patient and immense, just across the sea. Its dunes shift, its silence hums, its nights remain cold and endless. Yet somewhere in its memory, there's pride, a faint recognition that its harsh lessons gave birth to grace. The gardens of Al-Andalus were, in the end, a love letter to their place of origin. They took the discipline of the desert and translated it into comfort. They built gratitude into stone. It's strange to think that an entire civilization could express itself through irrigation. But perhaps that's the most honest form of expression. Empires brag about conquests. Gardeners build systems that keep feeding the earth long after the flags have faded. The Andalusi legacy survives, not in marble thrones, but in the sound of water moving through narrow channels. Each drop is an unwritten verse in the longest poem ever recited. As evening approaches, the palace returns to its familiar rhythm. Shadows stretch, fountains regain their shimmer, and the scent of orange blossoms thickens once again. Somewhere beneath the tiles, water continues its eternal rehearsal, repeating the same patient lines. If the builders of Al-Andalus could see their creation now, they might smile, not in triumph, but in recognition. The promise they made to the desert still holds, because in the end, that was the true miracle of Al-Andalus. Not conquest or architecture, but continuity, the ability to make something so gentle that it could outlast violence, so balanced that it could survive chaos. Water moves, stone endures, and between them lies the lesson. Beauty, if designed with care, can become its own form of resilience. As the last light fades behind the hills, the sound of the fountains deepens to a murmur. The air cools, carrying with it a faint reminder of sand and salt and distance. Somewhere far beyond the reach of walls, the desert waits, listening. It doesn't envy the gardens. It understands they are, after all, its most patient echo. The night air in Granada moves like a memory. It carries with it the scent of orange peel, cool stone, and something faintly metallic, the trace of water that has passed through centuries of hands, standing within the Alhambra's walls. After dark feels less like visiting a place and more like wandering through time's reflection. Everything here seems suspended, not quite belonging to any particular age. The arches hold starlight, the way they once held torchlight, and the fountains speak a language that has never needed translation. Perhaps that's the secret behind the enduring allure of the gardens of Al-Andalus. They are not relics of a vanished civilization, but instruments still tuned to the same note of tranquility. Their music hasn't stopped, it's simply been absorbed into the rhythm of the land. Even the silence is melodic. If you pause long enough, you can hear the faint intervals of dripping water echoing across courtyards, the same sound that soothed kings, inspired poets, and lulled children to sleep. The poets of Al-Andalus often compared their gardens to mirrors of heaven. but they also knew that paradise was fragile. They wrote not about victory or conquest, but about fleeting beauty, the scent of a rose that fades before morning, the play of light that lasts only an instant. Their verses weren't meant to immortalize. They were meant to remind the same humility guided the architecture. Nothing here shouts. Everything murmurs. The walls whisper scripture. The tiles shimmer quietly, and even the color palette, earth, water, and light, seems chosen to calm rather than impress. Modern visitors often describe the Alhambra as magical, though magic has nothing to do with it. What they are sensing is discipline, the accumulated patience of countless anonymous craftsmen who spent their lives carving, polishing, measuring, and perfecting so that the world inside these walls could hold still. Their names rarely survived in chronicles, yet their fingerprints remain on every stone. That too feels appropriate. The Andalusi worldview valued collective harmony over personal fame. Paradise wasn't meant to have an author. The endurance of these gardens is also a story of quiet reinvention. After centuries of change, after conquest, neglect, restoration, they have become both museum and metaphor. Each generation reinterprets them. Scholars see intellectual synthesis, artists see geometry made sensual, environmentalists see sustainability, and wanderers see serenity. Perhaps the most honest reading is simply this: the gardens are an argument against despair. They insist that beauty can be designed even in uncertain times, that order can exist without rigidity, and that water, properly guided, can outlast empires. It's worth remembering that these ideas were not born in isolation. The builders of Al-Andalus were inheritors of a long conversation stretching from Persia to Damascus to North Africa. They borrowed, adapted, and improved, creating something both local and universal. That continuity of thought, passing silently across languages and centuries, might be the most remarkable irrigation system of all. The flow of ideas rather than water, and yet, for all its sophistication, the legacy of Al-Andalus feels intensely human. There's tenderness in its precision, as if the architects understood that order without warmth would be sterile. That's why every courtyard contains a trace of imperfection, a line slightly off-center, a pattern that breaks symmetry, a fountain that murmurs unevenly. Perfection, they knew, belongs only to the divine. Human beauty needs a flaw to stay alive. The modern world, in its constant noise and motion, has little time for stillness. But the gardens endure as quiet rebuttals. They don't compete for attention, they wait for it. Their power lies in inversion. Instead of demanding, they invite. Instead of dazzling, they soothe. To walk through them is to be reminded that history doesn't always roar. It can whisper too, and sometimes the whispers are what lies. Late in the evening, when the moon rises over the Sierra Nevada, the courtyards turn silver. The fountains reflect the light like 1,000 slow-moving stars. Somewhere, unseen, the water shifts beneath the stones, looping through its ancient channels. The sound is so steady, it feels eternal. One could almost believe that time here flows backward, that every drop retraces its path to the moment of creation. The illusion is perfect, though the truth is simpler. The water endures because people continue to care for it. Paradise persists because someone keeps tending the pump. That small, practical faith maintenance as devotion is the true spirit of Al-Andalus. The idea that care itself can be sacred, that beauty is not a miracle bestowed once, but a responsibility renewed daily. Each generation of gardeners, masons, and caretakers adds their layer of time, like sediment in a riverbed. The result is not preservation so much as continuity, a living memory disguised as architecture. And perhaps that is why, even after all these centuries, the place still feels inhabited. Not by ghosts, exactly, but by presence. The lingering awareness of all who have paused here to listen. The courtyard doesn't need voices. The water does the speaking. It tells of exile and return, of drought and abundance, of the unending dialogue between humans and the elements they try to shape. It speaks softly, but it never falls silent. So the story circles back to where it began, with water moving quietly under the floors of a fortress that became a garden, and a garden that became a memory of paradise. The same water that once reflected the faces of caliphs now reflects the faces of tourists and caretakers. And yet, it doesn't discriminate. It only mirrors. It has outlived languages, dynasties, and empires. It will likely outlive us too. If you lean over one of the fountains just before dawn, when the air is cold and the surface perfectly still, you might see yourself there, suspended among the stars. The reflection will tremble as the first drop lands, sending ripples outward, folding you into its rhythm. For an instant, you'll be part of the same endless pattern, the one that began 1,000 years ago when someone first imagined paradise behind stone walls and decided to build it anyway. The fountains continue, tireless and unhurried, repeating their soft refrain through every passing century. If they could speak in words, they would say only what they've always said. The same quiet promise that has carried through all of history. I am still here. The curtain may fall for one act, but the stage is never empty for long. The lights shift, the air stirs, and a new scene emerges with more mystery than the last. This is salt roads of the Sahara, caravans across endless dunes. The Sahara at dawn doesn't look like a desert trying to kill you. It looks polite about it. Pale light spills over the dunes in soft gradients, the horizon barely distinguishable from the sky. The wind is calm, the sand cold underfoot, and for a brief hour, the desert seems to be holding its breath. Then the heat begins, subtle at first, and the landscape resumes its daily argument with anyone foolish enough to cross it. This is where the salt caravans began their work, a trade network so improbable it feels like myth, except that it lasted for 1,000 years. The caravans were not romantic adventures, they were business. Harsh, methodical, and utterly necessary. In an environment where water could vanish without apology, salt became both treasure and survival. It preserved food, balanced diets, and served as currency. People have been known to say that in West Africa, gold was traded for salt ounce for ounce, which is not precisely accurate, but close enough to show how seriously everyone took their seasoning. The salt came from the heart of the desert, from places like Tahaza and Taodeni, where men cut slabs from the ground as if mining for ghosts. There was no glamour in it. Workers hacked at the crust under a blinding sun, their tools ringing against the earth. The blocks they extracted, each roughly the size of a small suitcase, were greyish, gritty, and heavy. They were loaded onto camels, each animal carrying 2 or 3 at a time, and tied into a procession that could stretch for miles. The rhythm of the trade was slow and ancient. Load, walk, unload, and repeat, until geography itself gave up trying to stop you. The people who managed this impossible operation were the Tuareg, nomads who knew the Sahara the way sailors know the sea. Their world was made of wind and sand, and their economy was built on endurance. They called the salt caravans Azali, a word that carries the quiet pride of repetition. Every season they gathered in the northern reaches of Mali or Niger, dismounted their camels and began the trek north to the mines or south to the markets. They wore indigo-dyed veils that turned their skin a faint blue, a shade that became their signature. It wasn't for fashion, it was for protection against glare, wind, and other people's curiosity. Imagine the sound of such a caravan starting out. Bells on the lead camels, the scrape of hooves on rock, the mutter of traders adjusting loads. Then, as the miles accumulate, silence. The Sahara doesn't echo. It absorbs. Even thousands of feet shuffling through sand create more vibration than sound. Days would pass with little conversation. The horizon didn't move. The dunes simply rearranged themselves to keep everyone humble. At night, the cold arrived like a confession, and the sky unfolded its unbearable clarity. For travelers raised in towns of dust and noise, the stars must have looked close enough to touch, and just as useless. The journey from the salt mines to the trading centers could take months. From Tewedeni to Timbuktu, for instance, was roughly 450 miles, a distance measured less in miles than in endurance. Each caravan carried hundreds of camels, sometimes thousands, each one entrusted with goods worth more than most humans owned in a lifetime. The caravan leaders were logisticians as much as merchants. They calculated water needs, determined resting points, and memorized landmarks that shifted shape after every sandstorm. There were no maps, no compasses, only memory and a few reliable stars. Every so often, someone would get lost. The desert is cruelly democratic that way. You can be a novice or a veteran, it doesn't matter. A wrong turn, a misjudged distance between wells, a sandstorm that lasts longer than expected, any of these could end a life. Entire caravans occasionally disappeared, swallowed by dunes that erased all evidence. The survivors, if any, would return gaunt and silent, their eyes reflecting the color of the horizon. And yet, next season, new caravans formed, as if the desert had not just eaten the last one. The economics made the risk worthwhile. In the cities at the desert's edge, Gawer, Timbuktu, Walata, salt was gold in reverse. The people of the Sahel had fish, grains, and livestock, but little access to salt deposits. Without salt, preservation was impossible. Food spoiled fast, and life grew shorter. The slabs arriving from the Sahara were broken, weighed, and sold in smaller portions, traveling farther south by river and overland routes until they reached the forests of West Africa. There they met gold and ivory, cola nuts and textiles. The desert was the bridge connecting two worlds, the Mediterranean to the savannas, North Africa to sub-Saharan wealth. At its height, around the 13th and 14th centuries, the trans-Saharan salt trade sustained entire empires. The kingdom of Mali, under rulers like Mansa Musa, built its prosperity on those routes. The taxes collected from caravans crossing the Niger were enough to finance palaces, armies, and a reputation that reached as far as Cairo and Venice. When Mansa Musa made his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca, scattering gold so freely that he temporarily disrupted Egypt's economy, the wealth he carried came in part from salt money. It's an odd thought, the world's richest man funded by the desert's driest gift. In the north, cities like Sijil Massa and Gadames served as gateways for the trade, connecting the Sahara to the markets of Morocco, Tunisia, and the wider Mediterranean. There, the salt mingled with spices, copper, and cloth from Europe and the Middle East. The caravans became arteries of culture as much as commerce, carrying languages, technologies, and ideas along with their goods. Islamic scholarship traveled south with them. African gold and stories traveled north. The Sahara often imagined as a barrier, was actually a vast exchange floor, dry, dangerous, and indispensable. But the glamour, such as it was, belonged to the camel. Without that animal, the trade would have been impossible. The camel is a masterpiece of indifference. It carries burdens with an expression of existential annoyance, walks for days without water, and smells like exactly what it is, a survival machine. A fully loaded camel could carry up to 600 pounds, including salt, food, and water skins. In return, it demanded very little affection. The Tuareg treated their camels with practical respect, valued, maintained, and when necessary, eaten. The relationship was not sentimental, it was mutual endurance. The caravans moved mostly at dawn and dusk to avoid the worst heat. During midday, the men rested in what little shade they could find, often under the bellies of their camels. Meals were sparse: millet, dried dates, sometimes a bit of salted meat. Water was rationed with mathematical precision. The human body can survive 3 days without it, but the caravans didn't rely on that theory. They aimed for wells spaced roughly a day's march apart. Each well was a kind of temporary civilization, traders from different routes meeting, gossiping, exchanging news, and occasionally arguing about prices. In a landscape where everything looked identical, these oases were punctuation marks in an endless sentence. Timbuktu, at the southern end of the trade, became a kind of mirage that happened to be real. Founded in the 12th century as a seasonal camp, it grew into a hub of wealth and learning by the 15th. Its mosques and libraries stood as evidence that even in the shadow of the desert, scholarship could flourish. Gold and salts financed its manuscripts, its teachers, its rhythm of prayer and debate. Travelers from across the Islamic world described it with a mix of awe and confusion, a city of mud that glittered like a gem. Still, for every story of prosperity there were a dozen of hardship. The desert was not a kind partner. Sandstorms could strip skin raw, winds could bury wells overnight, and the monotony itself could undo the mind. The Tuareg learned to move through it as one moves through a difficult mood, without argument, without haste, with acceptance. They said little because words evaporated too quickly in the heat. The silence became part of the journey, a second horizon. If you stood in the middle of one of those caravans, say somewhere between Tawadeni and Timbuktu, you would see nothing but the backs of camels stretching to the horizon, each one swaying in rhythm, each step leaving a pattern that the wind would erase before sunset. The men walked beside them, faces wrapped in indigo, their eyes scanning for mirages or movement. The landscape offered no landmarks, only repetition, and yet they always found their way. The stars above were familiar, and so were the shadows of the dunes. In a world that seemed designed to confuse, memory was their compass. Even now, long after airplanes and trucks replaced the great caravans, some of the old routes are still walked, not for profit anymore, but for heritage and pride. A few Tuareg families continue to make the journey once or twice a year, more ritual than commerce, carrying salt the old way to remind themselves, and perhaps the world, that their ancestors turned emptiness into livelihood. The desert hasn't changed much. It's still there, enormous and indifferent, waiting to see who dares to cross next. As the sun sets over the dunes, the air cools rapidly. The light sharpens, the sand glows orange, and shadows stretch into eternity. Somewhere in the distance, a caravan prepares for another night march, its bells chiming softly. The sound carries farther than you'd expect in such vast silence, as if the desert itself were listening, and perhaps it is, keeping count of those who pass through and those who don't. The salt slabs gleam faintly under moonlight, each one a quiet testimony to endurance. Centuries may pass, but the trade's rhythm remains lodged in the sand's memory, the endless negotiation between human need and the desert's indifference. It's not a story of victory or defeat, just persistence, the kind of story that repeats itself long after the tellers are gone. The caravan drifts forward again, somewhere between night and dawn, when the sky hasn't decided which shade of blue to keep. There's no real beginning to a journey like this, only continuation. The sound of the bells, the rhythmic crunch of sand, the sigh of wind, all of it merges into a single pulse. The desert doesn't move fast, it moves perpetually. The Tuareg understood that rhythm intimately. For them, travel was not an interruption of life, but its natural tempo. Their families waited in distant oases or seasonal camps, tending goats and weaving cloth while the men guided the camels. The journey itself was a form of connection between north and south, between scarcity and abundance, between people who might never meet, but still depended on one another. Every few days, the caravan reached a well or an oasis. These places had names that carried the texture of relief. Insula, Arawana, Tegaza, each name whispered of survival. Wells were communal miracles, maintained by local tribes who demanded tribute for their use. The water was usually bitter, sometimes salty, occasionally tainted with sand, but it was life nonetheless. The animals knelt in gratitude that looked suspiciously like exhaustion, and men refilled their skins with careful reverence. Trade didn't happen, only at the endpoints. It unfolded in fragments along the way. A few camels might be sold, a few slabs of salt exchanged for dates or fabric. A merchant might join the group for a few days, then peel off toward another route. In that sense, the Sahara wasn't empty. It was a moving city, its streets made of sand, its walls made of wind. In daylight, the dunes played their usual tricks from a distance. They looked smooth and simple. Up close, they revealed their instability. Sliding under each step, the sand shifted constantly, sculpting waves that could rise or vanish within hours. Travelers learned to read them, the way sailors rid the sea, noticing subtle changes in texture and color that signaled direction. The mirages, though, fooled everyone. Pools of water appeared where none existed. Palms shimmered like ghosts. The experienced didn't trust their eyes, only their instinct and the low sun. The heat pressed down without mercy. At midday, the air shimmered until the world looked liquid. Conversation dried up. Men wrapped themselves tighter in their veils, not only against sand but against evaporation, each breath a small expenditure of moisture. The camels groaned softly, their patience infinite but not voluntary. Somewhere behind the line, a man coughed, then fell silent. The desert accepted the sound without acknowledgement. The Tuareg believed that to survive here, one had to cultivate calm, not courage, not strength, but composure. Panic wastes energy, and energy is life. They moved deliberately, never hurrying, even in danger. If a sandstorm approached, they covered their faces, knelt beside their camels, and waited for the storm to decide when it would end. Sometimes that meant hours, sometimes a day. The dunes would shift entirely, erasing their footprints, but the caravan always resumed, guided by memory and habit. At night, when the heat lifted, the desert became another planet. The cold struck fast, stealing warmth from skin and stone alike. The stars exploded across the sky, an architecture of light so precise that navigation felt almost sacred. The men prayed, not loudly, but with quiet movements toward Mecca. Then they ate in silence, dried meat, grain porridge, tea brewed, until it tasted like iron. The fire crackled low, careful not to reveal its presence to anyone beyond the camp. Bandits still existed, though few were foolish enough to attack a caravan in motion. The desert punished greed as efficiently as weakness. It is easy, from a safe distance, to romanticize all this. The endurance, the mystery, the perfect geometry of dunes under moonlight. But to the traders, it was work, brutal, repetitive, and unglamorous. Each trip meant months away from home, with the constant awareness that one megek could undo generations of profit. Camels could die, loads could spoil, water could run out, and yet the economy demanded movement. The desert did not forgive idleness. When they reached the salt mines, life became monotony of a different sort. Tadani, for example, was less a town than an endurance test. The mines lay in a barren plain, surrounded by nothing but horizon. Workers hacked through layers of salt and clay with iron tools, breaking the crust into rectangles that weighed up to 80 pounds. The dust coated everything, skin, lungs, and thought. The miners lived in huts made of salt blocks, slept on salt floors, and drank briny water that slowly eroded their health. They were often convicts or debtors, serving sentences through labor. For them, the caravan's arrival was both relief and reminder. The world beyond still existed, but it was far away. Once the slabs were ready, the merchants began loading the camels in pairs, balancing the weight carefully. A camel with uneven loads would refuse to move or collapse mid-journey, and both outcomes were expensive. The loading process took hours, sometimes days, while the air filled with the grunts of animals and the shouts of men arguing over weights. By the time the caravan set out again, everyone was already exhausted. The desert had a talent for beginning each trip in the middle. When the procession finally left the mines, it moved like a living wall across the horizon. Hundreds of camels, each step stirring small clouds that vanished immediately behind them. The wind carried the faint scent of salt so sharp it almost stung. The traders marched alongside their animals, their faces hidden behind cloth, their eyes narrowed to slits. Each man carried a dagger, a water skin, and a kind of resigned dignity. They looked less like travelers than like figures the desert had carved for its own amusement. The return journey south was slightly easier. The wind at their backs, the knowledge of markets ahead, but the dangers remained. Wells could dry, tempers could flare, alliances could fracture. Sometimes the desert swallowed not whole caravans, but single stories. A missing man, a lost load, a rumor that drifted back months later. Every traveler knew someone who had simply not returned. In the desert's arithmetic, disappearance was just another form of subtraction. When the caravan reached Timbuktu, Gao or Jenne, the relief was almost theatrical. The first sight of trees after months of sand was enough to make men laugh out loud. The air smelled of water and smoke. The river shimmered like an apology. The camels knelt as though giving thanks. The slabs of salt were unloaded, stacked, and measured with a ritualistic precision. Merchants crowded the market squares, their ledgers open, voices rising in a dozen languages: Arabic, Songhay, Tamashek, Fulani. The desert's silence dissolved into a chorus of negotiation. The traders were not only selling salt, they were also selling proof that they had endured what others couldn't. Each slab was a receipt from the Sahara itself, signed in sweat and dust. The profit margins were modest, but the prestige was enormous. To lead a caravan across the Sahara was to command respect, not because of wealth, but because of endurance. People trusted those who had returned from that emptiness, and then, once the goods were sold, they did something quietly heroic. They prepared to do it all again. The desert didn't wait, and the markets didn't rest. When the dry season ended, new loads were gathered, and the long procession began its way north once more. Each journey erased the one before, leaving no trace except in memory and a faint glimmer of salt dust clinging to a traveler's robe. There was no finish line, only recurrence. The Sahara didn't reward ambition, it rewarded rhythm. The people who survived it understood that progress was not forward motion, but repetition done well. The dunes shifted, the wind howled, and yet the caravans kept tracing the same invisible lines across the same indifferent sea of sand. That perhaps was the real lesson of the salt roads. Survival wasn't about conquering the desert, it was about cooperating with its indifference. Somewhere along that endless road, as the sun dips again below the dunes, a man pulls his scarf tighter and looks ahead. The horizon is as blank as always, and yet he walks as his father walked, as his sons will walk. The desert allows no monuments, but it remembers patterns and the rhythm of the salt trade. Step, pause, breathe, repeat has been written into its surface like a heartbeat the wind refuses to erase. The desert may have seemed endless, but every grain of sand eventually led to gold. That was the strange paradox of the Sahara. The emptier it appeared, the richer its trade routes became. The salt caravans, grim as they were, linked two worlds that could not have been more different. To the north, the Mediterranean world, cities of stone, libraries and scholars. To the south, the lush forests of West Africa, kingdoms with gold so abundant that foreign travelers compared it to sunlight trapped in the earth. Between them lay the Sahara, a vast filter of endurance through which all wealth had to pass. It wasn't simply about commerce, it was about faith, prestige, and survival all at once. The trade routes were veins in the body of the Islamic world, carrying not only goods, but also ideas. So from North Africa came scholars, jurists, and architects. From West Africa came gold, ivory, and stories of distant empires. The caravans were as much pilgrims as they were merchants, crossing the dunes in devotion to both prophet and God. By the 13th century, the kingdom of Mali had turned that devotion into policy. It wasn't just a participant in the trade. It was the trade. The rulers taxed every caravan that crossed their territory, earning more revenue than some caliphs could dream of. In exchange, they provided protection, maintained the routes, and built cities that glittered with mosques and markets. It was a practical arrangement, but also a philosophical one. The empire's wealth was both divine blessing and logistical triumph. The most famous of Mali's rulers, Mansa Musa, understood this better than anyone. When he set out on his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he didn't travel quietly. He brought with him an entourage so large that chroniclers in Cairo wrote about it for years afterward. Thousands of attendants, hundreds of camels, and more gold than anyone had ever seen leave West Africa. The caravan glittered across the desert like a moving legend. In Cairo, Mansa Musa's generosity was spectacular to the point of economic disruption. He distributed gold to the poor, bought gifts, funded mosques, and made donations on a scale so vast that the local market collapsed under the sudden influx of precious metal. Prices plummeted. The Sultan of Egypt, intrigued and slightly alarmed, sent envoys to meet this king from beyond the dunes. What they saw was not a barbarian monarch, but a man of education and composure, fluent in Arabic, surrounded by scholars and architects. Musa commissioned a mosque in Cairo before continuing to Mecca, leaving behind a ripple of awe that spread through the Islamic world. When he returned to Mali, his empire's reputation had transformed. Scholars and artisans followed him back, drawn by the promise of a cultured court in the heart of Africa. Timbuktu, once a modest trading post, blossomed into a center of learning. Its mosques, like the Jingreber and Sankora, became not just places of worship, but universities filled with manuscripts that discussed astronomy, medicine, law, and poetry. The salt from the Sahara financed it all. Every slab that crossed the dunes was, in its own quiet way, a page in that library. The connection between salt and scholarship might sound strange, but in Mali it made perfect sense. Salt was stability, and stability was what learning needed. The Caravans' steady rhythm provided the foundation for cities that could afford to think instead of merely survive. Timbuktu's scholars copied text by hand, their ink sometimes mixed with ground charcoal and gum. They debated law under wooden roofs, their discussions drifting out into courtyards perfumed with dust and dates. To outsiders, this was the mystical city of gold, but to those who lived there, it was a community sustained by logistics, the reliable return of camels and their burdens. The exchange worked both ways. From the north came new currents of faith and architecture. Traders from Fez and Marrakech brought the ornate calligraphy and plasterwork of the Maghreb, adapting it to local materials like mud and wood. The result was architecture that looked fragile but endured for centuries, a kind of soft grandeur sculpted from earth itself. The mosques of Timbuktu still stand, their wooden beams jutting out like ribs, not just as decoration but as scaffolding for the annual ritual of replastering, an act of preservation that feels almost devotional. Of course, not everything about the trade was noble. The same roots that carried salt and scripture also carried people. The Sahara was a highway for the slave trade long before European ships arrived on the Atlantic coast. Enslaved men and women were marched north alongside the caravans, their fates tied to markets in Morocco, Egypt, and beyond. The desert was impartial. It didn't distinguish between the cargo that enriched and the cargo that suffered. For every story of prosperity, there was another of loss buried under the dunes. The silence of the Sahara was large enough to hold both. The Tuareg, who guided most of these caravans, lived in a balance between independence and entanglement. They were not empire builders, but brokers, mediators between worlds. Their wealth came from tolls, protection fees, and the trade in camels themselves. They knew every pass and every well, every trick the desert could play. Outsiders admired them and feared them in equal measure. Their society was matrilineal in some traditions, their leadership often fluid, and their reputation for pride legendary. They were both romanticized and resented, which usually means they were doing something right. In Tuareg poetry, the desert appears as a living companion, fickle, cruel, and intimate. The dunes were not obstacles. They were partners in a long negotiation. The Tuareg word for freedom, ashak, implies both dignity and endurance, the ability to move through hardship without complaint. It's a virtue born directly from the landscape. To live among endless dunes, you learn not to expect gentleness. You learn rhythm instead. The trade routes also shaped religion in subtler ways. Islam arrived in West Africa, not by conquest, but by commerce. The merchants brought with them not armies, but manners, prayers whispered at sunrise, fairness in trade, contracts sealed with oaths to God. Over generations, these gestures accumulated into belief. By the 14th century, much of West Africa's elite had embraced Islam, blending it with local customs to create a faith as fluid as the trade that carried it. The call to prayer echoed in markets built on salt. The same wells that watered camels also supplied water for ablution. From a modern perspective, the scale of all this seems improbable. Thousands of miles of desert, countless lives, risked empires rising and falling, all for slabs of salt and bars of gold. But the logic was flawless. The world needed both, and the Sahara, inconvenient as it was, offered the only bridge between them. The people who crossed it didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as necessary. In the centuries that followed, the trade endured even as empires changed names. The song arose where Mali declined, their armies patrolling the same routes, their scholars writing in the same scripts. Go replaced Timbuktu as a capital for a time, then yielded again. The salt caravans never cared about political boundaries. They followed the oldest map in the world, the one drawn by survivors. When Europeans began exploring the African coasts in the 15th and 16th centuries, they heard rumors of these inland riches and imagined cities of gold waiting just beyond the dunes. Expeditions set out from the north, lured by myth and usually ended in disaster. The desert swallowed them without ceremony. The caravans, meanwhile, kept moving as they always had, unimpressed by new maps and foreign ambitions. The Sahara was no one's frontier. It was already fully occupied by those who understood its patience. Even now, when you look at a satellite image of North Africa, you can almost trace the faint scars of those ancient paths, lines where dunes meet rock, where old wells still glimmer with briny water. They look accidental, but they are the remnants of centuries of footsteps, hooves, and decisions. The salt roads never truly vanished. They just became quieter, hidden under the same dust that once guided them. As night drapes itself again over the deserts, the air cools and the stars return to their positions, steady as trade agreements, somewhere out there, perhaps near Arwain or Tadouedeng. A few modern caravans still move, smaller and slower now, carrying salt the old way. Their bells chime softly against the wind, the same sound that echoed through the golden age of Mali and beyond. The desert remembers their rhythm, even if the world has forgotten. The men walking beside the camels say little. They don't need to. Each footstep is a sentence, each breath a contract renewed with the horizon. The dunes shift, as they always have, and the salt gleams faintly under the moon, proof that even in the harshest emptiness, something endures. When the first Portuguese ships began edging down the West African coast in the 15th century, the desert didn't stir. The dunes don't react to innovation, they just exist. Yet beyond the horizon, history was quietly rearranging itself. New trade routes opened along the Atlantic, and the old salt roads of the Sahara began to feel the slow erosion of relevance. It didn't happen overnight. Nothing in the desert ever does. But over centuries, the rhythm that had carried empires began to thin, like a drumbeat fading at the edge of hearing. The coastal traders brought ships full of goods that once took months of sand and sweat to transport. Gold and ivory could now leave Africa by sea, bypassing the long camel trails. Salt, heavy and less glamorous, suddenly seemed less essential. Markets shifted, cities declined, and the caravans grew smaller. The Sahara, once the busiest empty place on earth, started to fall silent again. But silence is not absence, it's transformation. The Tuareg adapted, as they always had. Some turned to guiding European explorers who appeared with their maps and compasses, full of optimism and short on sense. Others became local power brokers, controlling wells and routes that still mattered to regional trade. The desert had trained them in pragmatism. Sentimentality was a luxury it never allowed. Timbuktu, once a beacon of wealth and learning, began to fade into myth. The manuscripts remained, tucked away in family libraries, their pages growing brittle under the dry air. Scholars still taught, but their audiences dwindled. Travelers who reached the city in later centuries found not the glittering metropolis of legend, but a quiet town of mud brick houses and gentle decay. Yet even in decline, the idea of Timbuktu grew larger than its reality. The name became shorthand for remoteness, as if the entire city had slipped one dimension sideways, existing more as imagination than geography. The salt trade persisted in fragments. In Mali, Niger, and southern Algeria, small caravans continued to make the journey from Taoudeni to Timbuktu. The routes shifted slightly to follow surviving wells, and the scale shrank, but the logic remained even into the 20th century. Men still loaded camels with salt slabs, each block wrapped in woven fiber and secured with rope. The desert no longer demanded it economically, but culturally, it refused to let go. Some things become traditions not because they are efficient, but because they remind people who they are. Life along the old routes changed in quieter ways. The wells, once crowded with traders, became local gathering places again. Families settled near them, building villages from stone and clay. Some of those settlements still bear names that recall their caravan past. Insula, Arawana, Bilmer, they are not cities in the traditional sense, more like long pauses in the story of motion. Their people still measure time by the passing of caravans, or by the absence of them. By the late 19th century, the colonial powers carved their neat lines across maps that had never needed them. France and Britain divided the Sahara into territories, oblivious to the fact that the desert ignored borders as easily as it ignored travelers. The old trade routes suddenly required permissions and papers. Taxes were imposed on paths that had once belonged to the wind. The caravans became bureaucratic inconveniences, and many disbanded under the weight of paperwork rather than sand. Still, the desert remained stubbornly itself. Explorers and geographers struggled to understand it, but their reports always carried a note of baffled awe. They marveled at the emptiness, missing the fact that emptiness was the point. To the Tuareg, to the Hausa, to the Songhai, the Sahara was never a void. It was a network, a shifting landscape that required knowledge rather than conquest. Its roots were drawn in memory, not ink. Every dune and shadow contained instructions for survival, written in a language outsiders rarely learn. In the early 20th century, motor vehicles began to appear, awkward contraptions with tires that deflated faster than egos. The French military experimented with crossing the Sahara by car, declaring victory whenever a vehicle made it from one side to the other without disintegrating. For a moment, it seemed the age of the camel had ended, but machines have their own fragility. They broke down where camels would have simply grumbled and continued. Fuel evaporated, engines overheated, and drivers discovered that sand is an unforgiving critic of overconfidence. The Tuareg watched all this with calm amusement. Their caravans might move slowly, but they moved. The camels did not need imported oil or spare parts. They carried their own logic, unchanged and unimpressed. Even today, in the most remote stretches of Mali and Niger, small camel trains still set out, with the same unhurried determination. Their numbers are small, but the ritual endures. Each caravan is a performance of memory, a living museum moving through an indifferent gallery of dunes. The salt itself has changed shape too. What was once currency has become heritage. In Tawadani, miners still carve blocks from the earth. Though the work grows harder each year as the groundwater shifts and the climate grows harsher, they earn little, barely enough to justify the labor. But the practice continues, partly for pride, partly for lack of alternatives. The salt is sold in Timbuktu, carried on trucks now instead of camels, but a few stubborn traders still prefer the old rhythm. They say the desert listens better to footsteps than to engines, and they might be right. The Sahara, for all its vastness, has an extraordinary memory. Fossilized riverbeds still lie hidden under its surface, reminders of wetter ages. Ancient petroglyphs on its rocks depict giraffes, elephants, and hunters from a time when this was grassland instead of sand. The desert has reinvented itself before, and it will again. Humans are only its brief tenants. The salt roads, in that sense, are not disappearing. They are transforming into another layer of history beneath the dunes. It's easy to forget that the Sahara was once an ocean floor, its sand the sediment of vanished seas. The caravans, unknowingly, were crossing the bones of an older world. Every step of a camel pressed into the fossils of shells and coral, long dead but still glittering faintly under the sun. Salt, born from that ancient water, returned to the surface as currency, a geological joke that humans turned into economy. The desert was always recycling itself, and the traders were just part of that endless circulation. Even as the 20th century deepened, the myth of the Sahara remained irresistible. Writers described it as a place of purity, emptiness, or revelation, none of which made it easier to live in. The few who attempted to romanticize its hardships often did so from comfortable distances. Meanwhile, the people who actually crossed it carried on with their measured stoicism, unmoved by poetry or philosophy. To them, the desert was not mystical. It was choosed, yet, in its quiet way, the Sahara still shapes imagination. Its vastness remains a metaphor for endurance, its silence a refuge from noise. The salt roads may have faded, but their logic persists in subtler forms. Trade, migration, memory. Somewhere, deep beneath the dunes, traces of those ancient paths remain packed into the soil. Archaeologists find fragments of pottery, camel bones, the occasional coin, all testifying to the long patience of commerce. At night, when the wind calms and the stars reclaim their dominance, the desert looks almost kind again. The same constellations that guided Mansa Musa's caravans still hang above, indifferent and exact. Time stretches here, blurring centuries into one continuous shimmer. A modern traveler could close their eyes and almost hear the faint jingle of camel bells, slow murmur of traders, marking another day survived. The rhythm hasn't vanished, it's just quieter now, half buried under progress and dust, and in that stillness, you can feel the ghost of the old trade routes breathe. The dunes shift like waves. The air smells faintly of salt, and for a moment, the centuries fold into one another. Somewhere out there, unseen, the desert keeps its own kind of archive, an unwritten history of footsteps fading into sand, of salt dissolving into air, of humans moving steadily across impossible distances. The caravans are gone, but the Sahara remains, waiting for the next echo to arrive. The desert never fully empties. It only pretends to. the way a quiet room pretends not to remember the conversations it once held. Long after the great salt caravans dwindled, the Sahara kept whispering their patterns. The dunes shifted over them, like pages turning, but the story beneath remained the same. A slow exchange between motion and stillness, between human will and the absolute indifference of nature. In the old Tuareg songs, still sung in camps from Mali to Niger, the caravans live on as rhythm rather than history. The verses move like footsteps, repeating phrases until they blur into trance. They tell of wells remembered, stars trusted, and camels that carried not just goods but patience itself. The songs rarely name the men who led the journeys. The desert prefers anonymity. What survives are the sounds, the cadence of hooves, the soft jingle of brass bells, the hiss of sand under wind. Even the Tuareg language, Tamashek, feels shaped by the landscape, its vowels drawn out like the horizon, its consonants clipped like stone. Silence, too, has a grammar out here. It can mean fatigue, respect, or warning. A pause between words might hold more information than the words themselves. The desert rewards those who listen rather than speak. Travelers learn to read small details, the direction of ripples in the sand, the way heat shimmered above the ground, the faint color change that hinted at an oasis over the next ridge. The Sahara offered no second chances, so attention became a form of worship. That attention still defines life on its edges. In the modern settlements that line the old trade routes, you can see the same habits in miniature. People rise early, before the heat begins its argument. Water is stored in clay jars wrapped in damp cloth, cooled by evaporation rather than electricity. Meals are simple. Millet, tea, dates, and conversation moves at the same pace as the sun. There's an elegance in that slowness, a kind of negotiated truce with time. Everywhere you go, salt lingers. It crusts the wells, seasons the tea, and glitters faintly on the skin after a day outside. It's easy to forget that what looks like dust on the surface is actually the residue of an ancient sea. Millions of years ago, this was a blue world, filled with coral reefs and shallow lagoons. The salt that made the Sahara rich was born from its extinction. When the sea evaporated, it left behind these mineral veins, waiting for someone desperate enough to mine them. Human civilization obliged. If you stand at Tawadeni today, the mining continues almost exactly as it did centuries ago. Men still chip at the crust with iron tools, their movements slow, their silhouettes framed by the endless plain. They live in houses made of salt blocks, a kind of absurd poetry. Homes built from the very thing that kills them by inches. The air is hot enough to warp thought. The work days begin before sunrise and end when the light becomes unbearable. For their labor, they earn a pittance, maybe a few dollars a day. Trucks come occasionally to collect the slabs, but many are still loaded onto camels for the traditional route south. The miners know the job is cruel, but they say the same thing their ancestors said. The desert feeds only those who respect its hunger. In Timbuktu, the salt still arrives, though now by truck more often than by hoof. It is sold in local markets, stacked in neat grey pyramids. Housewives chip pieces from the slabs with small hammers, the flakes scattering like glass. The salt will season food, cure hides, and sometimes serve as payment in the smaller villages. Even in the 21st century, it remains currency in everything but name. The caravan may have evolved, but the substance of its value has not. The desert's endurance has always been paired with fragility. Climate change, overgrazing, and shifting rainfall have begun to push the Sahara's edges farther south. Villages that once marked the border between desert and savanna now find themselves buried in sand. Wells dry out, fields disappear, and the people adapt again, as they always have. By moving, migration has replaced the caravan as the desert's new rhythm. Instead of salt and gold, the cargo now is human hope, carried on trucks and buses rather than camels. The routes are just as dangerous, and the silence just as deep. Yet despite the hardships, there's still something magnetic about this emptiness. The Sahara remains one of the last places where the human sense of scale collapses complete. To stand on a high dune and look across the horizon is to be reminded that you are small, temporary, and irrelevant, and somehow that's comforting. The desert is not hostile so much as indifferent, and there's a kind of peace in meeting a landscape that expects nothing of you. Historians often speak of the Sahara as a barrier, but it's more accurate to call it a filter. Ideas that crossed it came out changed. Islam absorbed African rhythms, African traditions adopted Arabic script. Architecture blended clay with geometry, trade blended languages. The Sahara's vastness didn't divide, it distilled. Those who survived its passage returned, altered, stripped of excess, their identities sanded down to essentials. Even the myths reflect this transformation. Some say the desert hums at night, a low vibration that travels through the sand when the wind dies. Scientists might call it booming dunes, caused by shifting grains that resonate like a drum. But to those who have lived here for generations, it is the voice of the earth, remembering. It's not superstition, it's listening. The Sahara sings to itself, the way old sailors hum when they mend their nets. For the Tuareg, the desert is not emptiness, but kin. Their poetry addresses it directly, calling it mother, teacher, or judge. One famous verse translates loosely as "You who give nothing, give us peace." It's not a plea for mercy, but a statement of accept to them. The dunes are not obstacles, they are conversations. Each journey is a dialogue between endurance and the infinite. That worldview stands in sharp contrast to how outsiders have tried to conquer or map the Sahara. To those who live within it, the point was never to control the desert, it was to coexist. The salt roads were not highways, they were relationships renegotiated every season. Each step of the caravan was both commerce and prayer, a ritual acknowledgement that survival depends on rhythm, not dominance. And perhaps that is the lesson the salt roads still offer today. Modern life measures success by speed, but the Sahara measures it by persistence. A camel takes one slow step after another, and still crosses an ocean of sand. A miner carves one block at a time, and still builds a livelihood from salt. The desert rewards the kind of patience the modern world has almost forgotten. As twilight returns, the wind begins its slow rehearsal. It lifts the top layer of sand and carries it just far enough to erase the day's footprints. The dunes sigh as they reshape themselves, and the horizon glows briefly before the stars reclaim it. Somewhere far away, a small caravan moves through the night, its bells faint but steady. The sound drifts across miles, fading in and out of the wind like an old memory trying to retell itself. No one in that caravan is thinking about history or legacy. They are thinking about the next well, the next sunrise, the next handful of shade. And yet, unknowingly, they are repeating the same motion that built kingdoms and connected worlds. Each footstep leaves a mark that will vanish by morning, and that vanishing is the point. The desert doesn't preserve, it renews. By dawn, the sand will be smooth again, the sky rinse clean, and the road invisible. But the pattern will remain in the air, in the stories, in the bones of those who once walked it. The Sahara remembers everything in its own language: wind, silence, and the taste of salt. Morning in the Sahara begins not with light, but with temperature. The cold that clung to the dunes through the night loosens slowly, almost reluctantly, and the first warmth seeps into the sand. Shadows stretch and then retreat. The wind, which has been whispering all night, falls quiet as if to listen. Somewhere far off, a line of camels stirs, their silhouettes etched against the horizon like punctuation marks in a sentence written by time itself. The world here does not wake. It resumes. Every morning is an act of continuity rather than renewal. The same pattern replayed with small variations. The salt roads have vanished in maps, but not in rhythm. Even now, some people move through the desert, guided by that ancient pulse, as if the dunes still expect a caravan to appear on schedule. Salt itself, the old hero of this story, remains everywhere, stubborn, glittering, and indispensable. It is in the air, in the soil, in the sweat of anyone who walks under this sun. The desert has a way of reminding humans that they too are mineral creatures, sustained by the same elements they trade. Salt may have lost its monetary shine, but its presence is still sacred. Every culture that lived on the edge of the Sahara found ways to honor it. Some burned it in rituals to drive away spirits. Others used it as a promise of friendship, a pinch shared at meals as a symbol of trust. It's easy to see why. Salt is permanence disguised as fragility. It dissolves in water, yet it endures for millennia buried under sand. In the medieval era, when merchants weighed it like gold, they were paying for more than flavor. They were paying for continuity. A society that could control salt could preserve food, command armies, and survive drought. It was less a spice and more a strategy. The wealth of kingdoms like Mali, Ghana, and Songhai was built on that invisible calculus. Even the European powers that later colonized North and West Africa understood this, though they pretended otherwise. When they drew their borders, they often followed the logic of old trade routes without realizing it. Lines on maps corresponded uncannily to the paths carved centuries earlier by camel caravans. In that sense, the desert still dictates politics long after its caravans have thinned. Its memory seeps upward through modern nations like groundwater, through rock, for the Tuareg, who have lived through every empire's arrival and departure. Identity remains as fluid as the sand. Their blue veils still stain their skin, their silver jewelry still catches the light, and their poetry still drifts between melancholy and pride. They move between old traditions and modern necessity with the same stoic grace that once carried them across the dunes. Some drive trucks now, hauling goods along asphalt roads that trace the ghosts of caravan paths. Others still keep camels, more as inheritance than livelihood. The desert teaches that all value eventually becomes symbolic. In recent decades, efforts have been made to preserve what remains of the salt trade. Anthropologists record the last living Azalai caravans, photographing men whose faces seem carved from the same dust they walk upon. Documentaries capture their departures from Tuadeni, camels loaded with grey blocks, men wrapped against the sun, setting out on a journey that takes 40 days one way and 40 back. They do it knowing the profit is meager, but the purpose is larger than profits. They walk because their ancestors walked. They move because stopping would feel like forgetting. In the city of Timbuktu, preservation takes another form. Libraries there, once home to hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, still hold texts on astronomy, law, medicine, and mathematics. Many were written during the age when salt funded scholarship. The pages are fragile, written in Arabic or in local scripts, often decorated with delicate geometric patterns. Volunteers and archivists work to protect them from humidity, insects, and conflict. In a way, they are still mining salt, only now it's the salt of memory, the mineral trace of an intellectual world that refuses to erode. Meanwhile, the Sahara continues to shift in its patient way. Sandstorms bury old wells and uncover forgotten camps. Archaeologists find pottery shards and iron tools in places that were once caravan rest stops. The remains are modest: fragments of leather, bits of rope, small fires hardened into clay by heat. Nothing grand, but collectively they tell the same story, that humans crossed the world's harshest desert, not by conquering it, but by learning its moods. Even the soundscape hasn't changed. If you stand in the middle of the Sahara, far from roads and villages, you can hear a kind of heartbeat in the air, a low hum produced by the wind moving over sand. It's the same sound the old traders heard when they stopped for the night. Some called it the desert breathing, others the earth whispering to itself. Scientists have more technical explanations: vibrations, resonance, friction. But the truth doesn't cancel the beauty. The Sahara hums because it remembers. In that hum, everything that ever happened here still exists. The strike of iron tools on salt beds, the muffled bell of a camel, the recitation of prayers at dawn. The sound carries not as noise, but as continuity. To listen is to join the long conversation between humans and their surroundings, a dialogue older than any written record. Modern travelers who attempt to cross the Sahara often describe it as a spiritual experience, which sounds dramatic until you realize what they mean. The desert reduces everything: ambition, fear, ego, into manageable grains. You can't argue with it or impress it. You can only move through it, step by step, until the landscape allows you to leave. The Sahara is not hostile, it's indifferent. That indifference, paradoxically, feels like, in a way, the salt caravans were always spiritual endeavors, disguised as economics. Each journey was a pilgrimage without temples, a demonstration of endurance that bordered on faith. The men who walked those routes may have carried goods, but what they transported most was continuity itself. Each season's caravan renewed the pattern, reaffirming the simple truth that motion was life. And so, even now, the desert keeps its rhythm. The wells fill and empty, the dunes advance and retreat, and somewhere a small group of travelers walks behind their camels, their footsteps erasing yesterday's road as they make tomorrow's. They are not symbols or reenactors. They are the living punctuation of a story the world keeps trying to finish, but never quite can. When night falls again, the air cools enough to bite. The stars pour back across the sky, bright and unbothered. A man adjusts his turban, stokes a small fire, and stares at the horizon. He says nothing, because there's nothing new to say. The desert has already said everything, and it keeps saying it in the same quiet tone, over and over, until even time seems to drift into silence. The salt in his cargo glows faintly in the firelight, grey, turning almost silver. It's heavy, solid, eternal. Yet it will dissolve one day, like everything else. That's the truth. The Sahara teaches with the patience of stone. Permanence and impermanence are the same thing, just seen from different distances. The desert doesn't keep monuments, only motion. The caravans understood that long before the rest of the world caught on. As the fire dims, the man lies back on his mat, looking up at the stars. He breathes slowly, evenly, as if matching his lungs to the pace of the universe. Somewhere in that rhythm lies the echo of all the traders before him, all the empires risen and gone, all the footsteps buried in the sand. It's not history in the academic sense. It's something quieter, a continuity that exists only while someone remembers to walk. By morning he'll rise, pack the salt, and move on. Just as his ancestors did, the desert will erase his tracks before noon, but not the gesture itself. The Sahara doesn't care about names, only about patterns, and the pattern, like the hum of the dunes, will go on forever. By the time the sun returns, the desert looks newly invented, as though the night had rebuilt it grain by grain. The dunes rearrange themselves with such confidence that even the most experienced traveler must squint, recalibrating where he is and what direction he thought he was going. The Sahara has always preferred disorientation. It keeps visitors humble and locals employed. The Caravans learned long ago that the only compass worth trusting here is patience. It's strange how something so vast can feel personal. The Sahara is not a landscape you merely look at. It presses against you, invades your breathing, gets into your clothes and your thoughts. It demands surrender, not in defeat, but in understanding. The salt roads that once stitched it together were acts of cooperation with this enormity. The people who crossed here didn't master the desert. They negotiated with it, season after season, until survival itself became a kind of art form. The art persists, even if its stage has changed. In small towns like Caravans, where the sand creeps almost to the rooftops, families still tell stories of the old caravans. Grandfathers recall the sound of 1,000 camels moving in sync, the ground trembling slightly beneath their feet. They describe the smell of salt and sweat, the faint tinkling of brass bells carried by the wind, long before the caravan itself appeared. Children listen, half disbelieving, as though hearing about a migration of ghosts. In a way, that's exactly what it was. A slow procession of necessity that has now become memory. But the desert has a long attention span. The wind still traces the faint paths where caravans once passed, smoothing them but never erasing them completely. When you walk there, you sometimes find the remains of campfires hardened into black circles, or a fragment of pottery half buried in sand. These are the breadcrumbs of history, scattered across a landscape that refuses to hold still. Archaeologists call them artifacts. The Tuareg call them reminders, and the reminders are everywhere, in the blue-dyed veils that still mark Tuareg identity, in the handmade saddles crafted to fit a camel's back like a second spine, in the rhythm of tea poured 3 times, bitter, strong, and sweet, each cup representing a different stage of life. The desert leaves no monuments, but it engraves habits. It writes its culture on the people rather than the land. In the 20th century, the Sahara's silence began to compete with radio static and engine noise. New nations claimed slices of its expanse: Algeria, Mali, Niger, Chad. But the sand ignored them. Independence came. Borders shifted, and yet the desert remained the same in different witness. For many desert dwellers, the new lines on maps felt irrelevant, drawn by people who didn't understand that dunes move and wells migrate. Bureaucracy is a poor match for the wind. Still, the old ways adapt in small, graceful gestures. A few caravans now mix camels with pickup trucks, hybrid journeys that look halfway between the 13th and the 21st centuries. Plastic water jugs replace goatskin flasks, but the salt blocks remain the same shape, carved by hand from the same dry earth. The cargo may ride on rubber tires for part of the route, yet the rhythm of trade hasn't completely lost its pulse. There are even festivals now, ceremonies celebrating the departure of the Azalai, where music and poetry turn commerce into remembrance. It's part history lesson, part survival tactic, ensuring that what once connected worlds doesn't dissolve entirely into sand. Tourists sometimes arrive, eager to experience authentic desert life. They ride camels for an hour, sip mint tea under tents, and photograph sunsets, so vast they seem artificial. The locals accommodate them politely. After all, every age has its own form of trade, but when the visitors leave, the desert resumes its own version of silence. Authenticity isn't an experience you can schedule. It's a rhythm you have to inherit, far beyond the reach of tourism, in the deep interior where dunes stretch like frozen waves. The desert remains what it has always been, a slow-moving ocean of wind and stone. Here, the air itself seems older, light scatters differently, softer but sharper, as though time refracts in the heat. A single caravan, if it passes at all, appears as a moving punctuation mark in eternity. The sight is almost comforting. The reminder that something human still dares to cross this immensity on foot. What few realize is that the Sahara has always been more connected than it looks. Beneath the sand lie ancient riverbeds and aquifers, traces of a wetter past when hippos roamed and grasslands bloomed. In some places, fossilized shells glitter in the dunes, tangible evidence that this desert was once an ocean floor. The irony is difficult to miss. Salt, the treasure that sustained civilizations here, is the residue of water long gone. Every grain of it is a fossilized memory of abundance turned scarcity, of fluid turned endurance. The people who crossed the Sahara have, in a sense, been walking across the memory of a vanished sea. That might explain the strange calm many travelers describe when they speak of the desert. Beneath the hardship, there's a serenity that feels almost aquatic, the same quiet found beneath waves. The dunes shift like tides, the wind hums like surf, and the horizon, forever receding, resembles a shore that refuses to arrive. The Sahara is an ocean pretending to be land, and the caravans were its sailors. The world beyond the desert rarely noticed how much it owed to them. The salt roads helped sustain economies from Morocco to the Niger Delta, linking civilizations that otherwise might never have met. They carried not just material wealth, but ideas, religious, architectural, mathematical, that shaped continents. Even today, echoes of those exchanges survive in languages, in trade customs, in the very notion of cultural intersection. The caravans might have moved slowly, but they moved history. And yet, when you strip away the grandeur, the story returns to something simple. People walking through heat and silence, hauling minerals across nothingness, because doing so kept life going. It's not a tale of heroism so much as one of persistence. The Sahara rewards patience, not ambition. It teaches that the measure of success is not arrival, but endurance. When night falls, the desert glows again under the starlight, and the old rhythm returns. The sand cools, the wind softens, and somewhere a lone camel bell rings faintly, answered by another farther away. The sound travels miles in the thin air, merging with the faint hum of the dunes. For a moment, it feels as if the entire landscape is breathing, a slow, steady exhale that has lasted for centuries. A man sitting by his small fire pours tea, the steam twisting upward into the dark around him. The silence feels alive, full of unseen memory. The salt he carries is stacked nearby, dull grey in the starlight, waiting for morning. He doesn't think of history or legacy, just of distance and direction. Yet, unknowingly, he is part the same continuum that began when the first camel was loaded with the first slab. The Sahara has made him, as it has made everyone who has dared to cross it, into a vessel for persistence. And when dawn comes again, because it always does, he will rise, tie his headcloth, and begin walking. The dunes will reshape themselves behind him, erasing his trail as they always have. The desert will remember in its own way, not through footprints, but through the echo of motion. Somewhere in that sound, the whisper of wind through sand, the faint chime of a caravan that may or may not still exist. The Sahara repeats its one eternal phrase, "I am still here." One flame flickers out, but another sparks in the dark, daring us to follow. And with it begins a story more haunting, more hidden, and impossible to ignore. This is life inside a Roman insula, crowded homes and daily struggles of the ancient city. The Roman insula, in many ways, was a city within a city. If you happened to stroll through ancient Rome, you'd have passed by countless buildings that to modern eyes might look like cramped, poorly built tenements, dark, narrow, a little jumbled. But to the average Roman, this was home. You see, the insula was the living arrangement for many of the lower and middle classes, often housing large numbers of people in a relatively small area. They were an essential part of the city's fabric, quite literally holding up Rome's sprawling urban landscape. The insula were tall, multi-story buildings, with shops on the ground floor and cramped apartments stacked on top. Most of these buildings were far from luxurious. The higher you went, the less you paid, and the less comfortable you became. Those at the top lived in dark, hot, poorly ventilated rooms, with limited access to water, no indoor plumbing, and a view that likely involved glimpses of more insular, perhaps a sliver of sky, and a whole lot of noise. Yet even in these less than ideal conditions, there was something undeniably Roman about it. The insula were social spaces, packed with life, movement, and constant activity. At street level, vendors hawked goods, families huddled in doorways, and the clamor of daily life filled the air. The upper floors, the apartments of the time, housed a mix of tenants, retailers, craftsmen, soldiers, retired veterans, and of course, the average Roman citizen who had little to do but survive. Roman cities were designed to be crowded. The architecture was part of a much larger scheme, an urban layout that had no concept of personal space in the way we do now. But that wasn't the most important thing to the people who lived there. What mattered was utility. People lived close because it was practical. That doesn't mean it was easy, though. The cramped quarters, the noise, the smells, those were ever-present challenges. Yet in many ways, this bustling mess of humanity was the pulse of the empire. Life in an insula was more than a series of logistical problems, though it was a test of patience and endurance, a kind of survivalism for the urban dweller. To live in an insula meant learning to get along with everyone, even if you didn't share the same values or background. Romans were, above all else, practical people, and in an insula, you had to make do with the space you were given. You'd share staircases, hallways, and courtyards. If you were lucky, you might even get a window, or at least a sliver of a breeze to escape the suffocating summer heat. Many of these buildings were made of cheap materials, wood, brick, and sometimes just stone. The upper floors were constructed hastily and lacked the sturdy foundations of more permanent homes. Fire was a constant threat, and it wasn't unusual for parts of an insula to go up in flames. The Roman equivalent of fire codes didn't exist, and the mixture of densely packed buildings, open flames, and wooden structures meant that even the slightest spark could send the entire block into chaos. In fact, one of the most striking things about life in an insula was how precarious it all was. The wealthier citizens lived in domus, spacious, well-appointed homes that were, by all accounts, relatively comfortable. But they were few and far between. The overwhelming majority of Romans lived in places like these, Insula, where the line between work and home was blurred. If you lived on the ground floor, you might open your door to find yourself face to face with a stall selling wine, bread, or pottery. Even if you lived on the top floor, the experience wasn't much better. The Insula didn't have elevators, obviously, so stairs were the primary means of access. These stairs could be narrow, rickety, and dark, and they were often shared by multiple families. If you had a neighbor on the second floor, you probably passed them on your way to your own cramped room. If you were unlucky enough to live in one of the uppermost apartments, you might have to wait for a while to get down, since everyone below you had to climb through your hallway to reach their own apartments. The air inside these buildings was stuffy, sometimes foul. The Romans didn't have air conditioning, of course, and the lack of proper ventilation meant that the smell of food, waste, and sweat often hung thick in the air. And while some insulae had access to public baths, many did not. The wealthy, of course, enjoyed private baths, but for most of the population, the public baths were both a social and practical necessity. Without them, Romans would have been left to deal with the sticky heat and the everyday grime that came with city living. But even in these conditions, the Roman world was a social one. The Insula were vibrant microcosms of Roman life, where neighbors gathered, friends hung out, and social connections were made in the hum of daily life. While it may not have been a luxury, it was a community. You would likely know everyone in your building, whether you wanted to or not. You'd exchange pleasantries in the stairwell, argue about the price of bread in the courtyard, and share a drink at the local tavern if you weren't too busy. And that's the thing. Despite the discomfort, despite the cramped quarters, people continued to live in the insulae because they were part of something larger than themselves. The insulae were hubs of activity, where every piece of the puzzle, whether it was a shopkeeper, a craftsman, or a soldier, came together to create the beating heart of the city. To live in an insulae was to live in the rhythm of Rome itself, constant, relentless, and filled with the noise of commerce, politics, and humanity. But not everything in the insula was communal. As with any crowded city, privacy was a luxury you could rarely afford. Most of the apartments were windowless or had only small openings high up in the walls that let in only a glimpse of light. This meant that the apartments on the top floors were often stuffy and unbearably hot in the summer, with little relief except for the occasional breeze from the rooftops. The wealthy, naturally, had the luxury of spacious rooms with better ventilation and more windows, but they still lived in a city that was not built for comfort. Even the construction of these buildings was less about elegance and more about necessity. In some insulae, apartments were stacked haphazardly, with little regard for order. This led to the creation of odd shapes and cramped corners, where light and air struggled to reach. These buildings weren't meant to last centuries. They were constructed to meet the pressing need for housing in a city that was growing too quickly for traditional homes to keep up. They were practical, temporary solutions meant to house an empire's workforce. The structures themselves bore the weight of this impermanence. Still, the insulae served their purpose. They provided shelter, they supported the economy, and they created a tight-knit community of Romans. Though the life inside may have been crowded, uncomfortable, and often frustrating, it was undeniably Roman. The Insulae were a testament to the tenacity of the people who lived in them, and they helped shape the city's identity. They were the arteries of Rome's pulse, where the mundane struggles of everyday life were woven into the broader narrative of empire. To fully grasp what life in the Insula was like, you have to imagine the great empire looming above it all. As you walked down the streets of ancient Rome, you'd pass temples dedicated to gods with names like Jupiter and Mars, the echoes of empire at every turn. You'd also pass massive villas, the homes of the rich and powerful, with expansive gardens and intricate mosaics. But in the shadows of all that grandeur, there was a quieter, less glamorous rhythm to life. The Insulae were, by design, a response to the overpopulation that plagued Rome. By the 1st century AD, the city's population had exploded. Some estimates suggest that there were more than 1 million people packed into its walls. This growth wasn't the result of birth rates alone. It was driven by migration from the countryside. Rome, as the center of power, wealth, and influence, attracted men and women from all corners of the empire. The work was plentiful, but the housing wasn't. The rich lived in houses called domus, a word that sounds lovely but was far removed from the rough existence of the Insula. These homes were spacious, airy, and designed with comfort in mind. They had courtyards, gardens, running water, and private rooms that offered seclusion, luxuries the majority of Romans could only dream of. But for most, the Insula were where life unfolded. The wealthy of Rome didn't just live in palaces. They shaped the empire's pulse. Senators, merchants, landowners, and military commanders all called the grand buildings home. But their wealth, while it was vast, had little to do with the everyday functioning of the city. The empire's true engine was the working class, those who lived in the Insulae, the laborers, the artisans, the soldiers, and the traders who kept Rome fed, clothed, and supplied. Now imagine being one of those workers. You rise early, before the sun even stretches across the sky. The day is already warm by the time you step into the noisy, crowded streets, dodging carts filled with grain, wine, and livestock. The air smells of bread and incense, of fish and wine, and occasionally the distant stench of the river that runs through the heart of the city. These streets, lined with shops and taverns, are the lifeblood of Rome. They are filled with people bargaining, laughing, shouting, and trading, often all at once. Once you reach the entrance of your insula, a heavy door leads you up a narrow staircase to your apartment. If you're lucky, your door opens to a small, dingy room where the light is barely enough to read by. On the wall you might hang a few simple wooden shelves, a clay jar, and a cot made of straw. The room smells of sweat, dust, and whatever food you last cooked. Probably something simple like lentils or porridge, just enough to keep you going. You don't have a bathroom. There's a shared latrine somewhere in the building down the hall or on the ground floor. It's not exactly a private affair. People tend to use it at all hours, and it's as unpleasant as you might imagine. In the morning, you'd hear the clatter of the neighbors, maybe the shriek of a child, or the loud chatter of someone selling wares downstairs. If you're lucky enough to have a window, it probably faces another insula across the street. You won't be able to see much, maybe a sliver of sky or a roof line, and that's about it. The wind often doesn't reach your window, so the apartment feels stifling in the heat of summer. You might have a tiny grate near the roof for ventilation, but it's little relief when the Roman sun is at its peak. Inside your insula, you're not just living with your immediate family, you're living with everyone else who can't afford better. In the same building, someone sells bread or fabric, and another might be a carpenter or a tailor. The walls between you and your neighbors are thin, and there's a constant hum of activity. If you're unlucky, you're stuck with noisy neighbors who never stop arguing, or a family with a baby who cries through the night. But that's the price of living in a city like Rome. Everyone shares space, whether they like it or not. At night, the sounds of the city spill into your insula. Footsteps, laughter, distant music. Or you may hear the clang of tools as a worker repairs a roof, or the low murmur of conversation from the neighboring apartments. It's loud at first, but after a while you learn to sleep through it. The city never truly stops. But in this crowd, you have to learn to navigate social dynamics. The Roman Insula, despite its noise and chaos, was a tightly knit community. Neighbors depended on one another. There was always the chance that someone might need your help, whether it was an extra loaf of bread, a place to borrow a tool, or someone to watch the children for a while. In return, you might need their help one day too. Living in such close quarters also meant that privacy was a luxury few could afford. Even if you locked the door, someone was likely to knock and interrupt your day. You'd share stairways and courtyards and possibly even hallways. You would encounter your neighbors regularly, and for better or worse, the Insula were an intricate web of interactions. You had to learn how to live with that, how to be polite even when you didn't want to be, because in the Insula the whole building was one family, no matter how inconvenient it became. As the day ends, you take your small piece of dinner, maybe a piece of bread, or a small bowl of stew, and sit by the window. Outside, the street below starts to quiet, the air cooling just slightly. The city's noise recedes, leaving behind only the sound of your neighbors' voices, carried faintly through the walls. After all, Rome never truly sleeps, but in the Insula, life moves slowly, quietly, as it has for centuries, even as the grand empire outside continues to shift and grow. Tomorrow, you'll wake to the same sounds, the same smells, the same crowd, but for now, as the city settles into the night, you have a brief moment of peace, quiet, and warmth, just enough to gather the strength for another day. Living in an insula wasn't just about surviving, it was about making do in a world that constantly moved and shifted around you. And Rome itself. Rome was a city of endless transformation. The empire's growth had a way of forcing its people to adapt. As the empire expanded, the Insula, crowded as they were, began to swell with new faces and demands. If you were a resident of one of these insulae, it wasn't just about living day to day, it was about adjusting to the constant influx of new people. You'd see new neighbors come and go, some arriving from the provinces, others from far-off corners of the empire. Romans, whether born in the city or from the conquered lands, were a mix of people who were very much aware of the great empire that loomed over them, though it often felt like the empire itself existed just beyond reach. New construction was a constant fact of life. As the city sprawled outward and upward, more insula were built to house the growing number of residents. It was no longer enough to have just a few cramped apartments on top of a storefront. Now, entire blocks were carved into towering apartment complexes, stacked like boxes with little more than the street-level shops offering any semblance of the city's famous luxuries. As the population increased, the demand for space and for shelter drove even more Romans into the sky. The higher floors in an insula were often the least desirable. They were far from ideal when it came to comfort. Light was scarce, airflow was minimal, and the smell of the city below could make even the most seasoned city dweller recoil. But still, the work continued, because the alternative was far worse. The constant traffic of Romans in and out of the city kept the insula full. and for many, the Insula was the best option they had. Rome was a city built on the backs of its workers, and the Insula were their homes. Yet, there were small luxuries. Some residents, having worked their way up the economic ladder, might have managed to buy an apartment with a small balcony or a bit more space. Those extra windows would let in just enough light to make their rooms feel a little less suffocating. Some might even have a small garden in a tiny courtyard, just a few plants, herbs or vines to give them some semblance of the countryside they left behind. Still, the people who lived in the Insula weren't looking for luxury. They were looking for stability. To live in an Insula was to face the challenges of Rome head on. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't prestigious, but it was real. Every day in the Insula was a reflection of the Roman experience, a mix of grind and routine that defined much of the empire's lower classes. Inside the Insula, your life revolved around simple but essential things: finding work, getting enough food, staying healthy, and surviving. If you were a craftsman or a merchant, your work might take place on the ground floor, just beneath your apartment, where the sounds of the city could make it hard to concentrate. If you were a soldier or retired veteran, you might have a modest room on the upper floors, keeping your personal space far from the noise, but still very much a part of the constant rhythm of the city. Sometimes, though, the work in the Insula could be perilous. If you worked as a baker, you might find yourself up early, baking bread to supply the city's hunger, as fires in the Insula were always a threat. Or maybe you worked as a carpenter, mending the damaged wood beams of the Insula, risking your life in the scorching heat of the day, while balancing on roofs high above the streets. But for most people, the work was routine and steady, sweeping, mending, carrying goods. Still, Rome's expansion pushed the boundaries of comfort. The Insulae were crowded, but they were also filled with movement, people coming and going, laughing, shouting, bargaining, always in motion. There was a constant hum of activity, but while the city was growing and expanding, a certain sense of stability prevailed. It was an empire built on routine. After all, in Rome, everything had its place, even if it was only a small apartment above a bakery or a butcher shop. There were times when the city didn't feel so much like a living organism, but a labyrinth. Narrow alleyways crisscrossed between the insulae, making it difficult to tell where one building began and another ended. You'd have to duck through these passages, following the worn cobblestones underfoot, past women mending clothes on doorsteps, children playing with scraps of pottery, and dogs weaving in and out of the crowd. Sometimes, late at night, you'd hear the murmurs of conversation from the apartments above. The city never fully quieted, not even in the dead of night. If you weren't careful, you'd overhear personal details you had no business knowing: who was cheating on whom, who owed money to whom, or who was angry about the latest city ordinances. If the Insula was crowded with noise, the walls between the people within were just as thin. Privacy was a luxury that few could afford. Even if you closed your shutters at night, you'd likely hear your neighbors talking, laughing, arguing. You might catch the sounds of music from the apartment next door, or the faint clatter of pots and pans being cleaned after a late meal. The boundaries between the private and the communal were always hazy, and in many ways, that was how the Roman world worked, living in close proximity, with a strong sense of community, but with just enough distance to maintain a semblance of privacy. In the early morning, before the chaos of the day fully descended on the Insula, you could hear the scraping of broomsticks sweeping dirt from doorsteps. The merchants would be opening their shops, laying out their goods for the day: fish, wine, olives, bread. If you were lucky enough to get up early enough, You might snag a hot loaf of bread or a freshly cooked pastry, small rewards for the early riser. For the children living in the Insula, life wasn't much better than for the adults. They grew up around by noise, by the smell of street food, by the constant shuffle of Roman life. The streets were their playground. The courtyard was their classroom. They didn't have much, but they were part of the pulse of Rome, learning from the adults, understanding how the system worked, participating in a rhythm that was ancient and relentless. Yet, through all the noise, the rush, and the struggles, there was still a sense of pride in being a Roman. For the people of the Insula, even though their homes were far from the lofty comforts of the domus of the elite, they were part of something much bigger. They lived and worked in the heart of the empire, the most powerful civilization the world had ever known. And in that small, crowded apartment above the bustling streets, they carried a piece of it with them. They were, in their way, the backbone of the empire, the ones who kept the wheels of commerce and life turning. The Insula may have been cramped and noisy, but they were also the lifeblood of the great city that stretched toward the heavens. In their humble rooms, they had a stake in the empire's future, even if that future was written on the walls of their tiny, overcrowded homes. Living in an insula wasn't just a matter of cramped space. It was about survival in a city that never stopped moving. It wasn't all hustle and bustle, though. In the quieter moments, the real daily struggles of the people who lived in the insula were made clear, a constant balancing act between work, family, and the city's unrelenting demands. Life in the insula was about making the most out of what little was available, and that often meant sharing, negotiating, and sometimes going without. The street itself was often where the struggles were most visible. The Insula were connected to the streets by narrow, winding alleys that never seemed to lead anywhere, and were always packed with people moving in every direction. At the ground level, the streets hummed with energy, but that same energy was both a lifeline and a challenge. For the residents of the Insula, the city's public spaces were as important as their homes, and often just as difficult to navigate. For most, the daily grind started early. Rome, as the heart of the empire, needed goods and services constantly. Whether you were a baker, a tailor, a soldier, or a craftsman, your job didn't wait for the sun to rise. You might have a few hours of rest in the late afternoon, but the mornings were a rush. You'd pull yourself out of bed, often still half asleep, and head down the rickety stairs of the Insula to open your shop or get to your work. Most of the shops in the Insula were small and cramped. If you sold food, you'd likely have a stall outside, with bread or fruit or meat displayed in the open air. Vendors would shout over each other, calling out to passers-by, hoping to attract business. The marketplace was chaotic, full of the shouts and haggling of people trying to make a living. For some, it was their only source of income. The pace was relentless. The work was simple, but exhausting. It wasn't just about doing your job, it was about constantly competing with others who were doing the same thing. A baker had to ensure his bread was always fresh, and a fishmonger had to ensure that his fish didn't spoil too quickly in the heat. Competition was fierce, and the stakes were high. If you couldn't sell your goods, you didn't eat. And it wasn't just the market that caused stress. Every aspect of city life in Rome was packed with noise and movement. The streets were filled with carts, children, and travelers from all corners of the empire. Roman soldiers, ever vigilant, marched through the streets, making their way to the nearest barracks or out on a patrol. These soldiers were the muscle of the empire, and they moved with purpose, their presence reminding the citizens that Rome's power reached even into the smallest corners of the city. But for the average Roman, the soldiers were just another part of the crowd, another layer of noise in an already cluttered space. Then there were the taverns, Though often considered more of a luxury for the working class, they were still an integral part of life in the Insula. Here, you could grab a drink after a long day's work, catch up on the latest gossip, or share a meal with friends. But the taverns also brought their own set of problems. Drunken brawls were not uncommon, especially late at night. With tensions high, tempers could flare quickly, fights spilled into the streets, and the sounds of shouting could be heard echoing off the walls of the Insula. A reminder that not all was peaceful in the city. The Romans, being practical, didn't shy away from conflict. They understood that noise and disorder were part of life in a crowded city. For the people who lived in the Insula, however, it wasn't just about tolerating the noise. It was about surviving it. The very design of the Insula contributed to the problem. Apartments stacked on top of one another, with thin walls and crowded stairways, often reverberated with the sounds of the street below. Yet, in this chaos, there was also camaraderie. Neighbors in the Insulae had to rely on one another for help and support. It wasn't unusual for families to share resources, like food or tools, or to pitch in when someone was in need. The close quarters and constant interactions meant that you didn't just live next to people, you became involved in their lives. A mother might ask the neighbor for help in watching her children, or an elderly woman might depend on the young man downstairs to help carry her groceries. Even if you weren't friends with your neighbors, you would know them by sight. The sheer density of people meant that you couldn't avoid knowing each other, whether you wanted to or not. In a sense, the Insula were both the most isolated and the most communal spaces in Rome. It wasn't easy, though. For the poor and the working class, it was a constant fight against the odds. Food was never guaranteed, and many in the Insula lived in near poverty. The bread lines were long, and on some days there simply wasn't enough to go around. At times like this, the desperation showed. People would turn to anyone willing to offer a handout or barter for goods they couldn't afford. Despite all this, the Roman government did what it could to ease the burdens of its citizens. The grain dole, or annona, was one of the ways Rome ensured that its citizens didn't starve. The government would distribute free or subsidized grain to those in need, making it easier for the poorer classes to survive. But even with this assistance, life in the Insulae remained a constant battle for basic needs. One of the most pressing challenges was maintaining health. In the Insulae, sickness spread quickly. The water supply was often shared, and without proper sanitation, diseases could flare up. Roman public health systems, while relatively advanced for their time, couldn't prevent the spread of infection. In the crowded, tightly packed buildings, public baths provided some relief, but for many they were simply another part of the routine, a place to clean up after work and catch up with friends. The Insula were also a constant challenge in terms of safety. Rome was a city full of opportunity, but it was also full of danger. Street crime, particularly theft, was common. Pickpockets, thieves, and bandits operated in the shadows of the bustling streets, preying on the unwary. In some cases, families would lock their doors tightly at night, hoping to avoid the risk of being robbed. At times, the Insula seemed to represent the wild, uncontrolled nature of Roman life, untamed, a little reckless, but always moving forward. Still, despite the challenges, there was a certain rhythm to it all. The noise, the struggle, the constant hum of city life. It was a rhythm the Romans knew well. It was this same rhythm that made Rome the empire it was. And it was this same rhythm that kept the people of the Insula going day after day, despite all the hardship. For the Romans who lived in the Insulae, it wasn't about escaping the chaos. It was about embracing it, adapting to it, and making it work. When the evening came and the noise of the street began to fade, the Insula settled into a strange, quiet rhythm of their own. The distant sounds of the city drifted into the apartments, mixing with the quiet murmurs of neighbors. And in those moments, between the rush of the day and the stillness of night, life in the Insula became something more than survival. It became an unspoken bond, a shared experience between those who had learned to live in the shadows of empire. As much as life in the Insula was defined by the daily grind, it was also shaped by the understanding that nothing was permanent. Not the buildings, not the people, and certainly not the empire that housed them. Rome, at the peak of its power, seemed indestructible, a colossus stretching across continents. But the cracks were there, hidden behind the bustling streets and the constant energy of the city. For those who lived in the Insulae, the fragility of the empire was a reality they could sense but not quite grasp. Their lives were shaped by the whims of politics, the instability of the economy, and the dangers that lurked in the margins of empire. Life inside the Insula wasn't just a fight against the elements. It was a battle against an unseen force. The vastness of the empire loomed overhead, but to most of the residents in these crowded spaces, the empire felt distant, almost abstract. They were the ones who made the empire run, not the ones who shaped it. They were the laborers, the merchants, the artisans, the soldiers who fought the empire's battles, yet never held the reins of power. But in the background, something was changing. The empire that had once been unified under strong leadership was beginning to feel the weight of its own size. By the 2nd century, Rome was at the height of its territorial expansion. But this expansion came at a cost. The empire was vast and diverse, stretching from Britain in the northwest to Egypt in the southeast. The Romans had conquered new lands and new people, but managing such an empire required immense resources, both human and material, for the residents of the Insula. This had tangible effects. The empire's military campaigns needed to be financed, and taxes were one way to cover the cost. The centesima rerum venalium, a sales tax, for example, affected merchants and artisans, those working in the shops that filled the lower floors of the Insula. As the state's need for funds grew, so too did the burden on the average citizen. While the elite lived in relative comfort, the working-class Romans found themselves grappling with rising prices, economic instability, and at times, the collapse of local businesses. As the empire expanded, so too did the demands placed on its infrastructure. The Insula, once a solution to overcrowding, became a reminder of how stretched the city was. The streets that filled with the bustle of trade and commerce also filled with debris and refuse, causing sanitation problems that led to diseases spreading faster. As much as the Romans prided themselves on their engineering marvels, roads, aqueducts, and public baths, many of the city's residents were left to deal with the practical consequences of living in a space that was too crowded for its own good. But in the grand scheme of things, this was just a part of Roman life. The daily challenges of living in an insula were accepted as part of the deal. For many, these struggles were just another sign of the growing pains of an empire that had reached the limits of what one city could support. They dealt with the noise, the heat, the overcrowding, and the lack of privacy because they had no other choice. The Insula were not just their homes, they were their survival mechanisms, holding together a fragile social order. Even the buildings themselves were a reminder of the instability of it all. They were constructed quickly, with little attention paid to long-term durability. Many insula were made from wood, brick, and stone materials that could easily be damaged by fire or natural disasters. Earthquakes, which Rome was not immune to, could send entire neighborhoods crumbling. The early Roman historian Livy wrote about the Great Fire of 31 BC, which destroyed much of the city. The fire was a stark reminder that the empire's infrastructure, no matter how grand, was not invincible. The Insula were an ever-present reminder of this instability. They were both the result of the empire's success and a symptom of its stress. The architecture that filled Rome's skyline, those crowded buildings, was a patchwork solution to the empire's own ambition. The Romans, with their penchant for innovation, had created these structures as a way to make the most of their space. But with the rise of wealth inequality and increasing social divides, the Insula, meant to house the working-class Romans, often became overcrowded and poorly maintained. The residents of the Insula understood this fragility. They might not have been the architects of the empire, but they lived in its shadow. The actions of emperors, the decisions made by military leaders, and the fluctuations of the economy all rippled through the Insula in ways that were felt deeply. When the economy faltered, businesses failed. When the empire waged wars, soldiers were sent off, leaving families behind to fend for themselves. The weight of the empire's decisions fell on the shoulders of those who lived in the Insula, often without their knowledge or consent. Despite the challenges, there was a strange kind of resilience in the Insula. Residents may have had little control over their fate, but they had the power to endure. The daily struggles of Roman life were part of a broader tradition of toughness and adaptability. To live in an insula was to face adversity, but it was also to be part of something larger than oneself, a part of an empire that spanned continents, with all the glory and complexity that came with it. The Insula weren't glamorous. They were cramped, uncomfortable, and often dangerous. But they were also the lifeblood of Rome. The people who lived there may not have been in charge of the empire, but they made it work. The shops they ran, the food they sold, the goods they traded, all of it kept the empire running. Rome's great monuments, the Colosseum, the Forum, the Pantheon, were made possible by those who lived in the insulae, by those who kept the engine of empire moving, no matter how difficult the work was. As the centuries passed, the empire began to wane. The problems that had always been present in the insula, overcrowding, poor living conditions, and economic instability, became even more pronounced. Rome itself grew more fragmented, and the empire, once so mighty, began to fracture. The insula, once symbols of Roman ingenuity, began to deteriorate. The city fell into decline, and with it, the once thriving community of Insula residents. Yet, even in their decline, the Insula represented something lasting. They were a testament to the resilience of the Roman people, a reminder that life in the empire wasn't always about grandeur or glory. It was about everyday survival, about making a home in a city that never stopped moving. The Insula, with all their flaws and imperfections, were the true heart of the Roman world. May this story settle in your heart like a whisper, and may your dreams be calm and kind. Good night.